Thank you. Order. If there are no further points of order, the clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill, second reading.
Now. Thank you. To move the second reading of the bill, I call, thank you, the Secretary of State for the Home Department, Secretary Sajid Javid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this country faces significant threats to our national security. The first, the ongoing threat posed by terrorism to the safety and security of our communities and to the freedoms we cherish as a nation. And another is the threat posed by hostile state activity, which we saw most recently in Salisbury. As has been said many times before in this House, our police and our intelligence agencies are unwavering in their commitment to protecting us and keeping this country safe. They are ready to put their own lives on the line to help save others. It is because of this commitment and their professionalism that 25 Islamist terrorist attacks have been disrupted since 2013. 4 extreme right-wing plots have also been foiled since the Westminster attack. But as we know all too well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there were 5 terrorist attacks last year. 36 people were murdered. There are many more who are still grieving or coming to terms with those life-changing injuries, and as a result of these terrorist atrocities that took place in both London and Manchester. We owe it to these victims and the survivors to do our very best to prevent attacks like this from happening again. Of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as Home Secretary, I do not want to offer false hope. No Home Secretary can guarantee that there won't be another terrorist attack on their watch. It's impossible for me to promise that there won't be more grieving parents, partners and children because of some senseless act of terrorist violence in the future. But what I can do as Home Secretary is to take a long, hard, forensic look at the powers that are available to our police, the security services, the prosecutors and the judiciary, and make sure that they have what they need. That they have the powers to tackle the evolving threat to the UK from terrorism and from hostile state activity. That they have the powers to keep the public safe and to protect our national security. That this is what is in this wide-ranging counter-terrorism and border security bill. It's what it's all about. It's about keeping the people of this country safe. I will.
I'm very grateful. He's mentioned wide-ranging. Isn't that absolutely the key thing? Wide-ranging and flexible. Because those who wish this country and our fellow citizens ill are always trying to keep one step ahead of our rules and regulations. That's why it's important to have that flexibility to make sure that all of the tools that we need and our agents need are available to them.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is, of course, absolutely right. And what he and others, other honourable members, will see from this bill is that much of this bill is about updating powers that already exist, but making sure that they reflect the modern age. So, for example, when I come on to some of the powers around internet and online content. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this important piece of legislation will allow the police and MI5 to disrupt threats earlier and to ensure that our laws reflect the modern use of the internet. It will change existing laws to manage terrorist offenders better, and it will allow more effective investigations. It will also give police more powers to investigate hostile state activity. Yes, of course.
My honourable friend may be aware that in the previous bill dealing with the same subject matter, I put down an amendment relating to terrorists who were coming from other countries and saying that effectively they should not be allowed back into this country, and that measures should be taken. Now, I know that the Minister of State is aware of this. Don't want to go into it in detail, but during the committee stage, I am intending to put down an amendment regarding that, and I'd be grateful if it would be given careful consideration, because people are finding there are far too many people coming back into this country, relying on human rights legislation, and then being in the position of radicalising other people in the jails.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, first I know that my honourable friend has taken a great interest in these matters for many, many years. And anything he has to say on this issue, I will listen to carefully, and so will the Security Minister. And I look forward to seeing any amendments that he puts forward. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in March, we saw the attempted assassination in Salisbury of Sergei Skripal using a deadly nerve agent. This also put his daughter Yulia and Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey and many others in danger, including the brave men and women in the National Health Service and our frontline officers who did all they could at the scene in the weeks and months since, have continued to do so, and also have worked hard to save the Skripals. The attack was highly likely to be the work of the Russian state, a conclusion that is shared by many of our international partners. They joined the UK in demonstrating to the Russian government that such actions are undermining the rule of law, their actions that they take are undermining the rule of law and international norms, and they have serious consequences. But events in Salisbury are part of a pattern of behaviour by the Russian government. And the Russians are, of course, not alone in engaging in hostile activity that threatens our United Kingdom. So it's high time that we harden our defences against hostile state activity. I will first, then I will.
I'm very grateful. He's been very generous with his time. He's mentioned my constituent, Nick Bailey, who was the police officer at Salisbury. Wiltshire Police have been incredibly helpful to Nick and to his family, with whom I'm liaising. Can I ask my right honourable friend to confirm in the dispatch box that his department and Wiltshire Police will continue to give Nick and his family all the support that they need, given the very unique circumstances of the incident and the ramifications that he and his family have had from it?
Mr. Deputy, I'm happy to give my honourable friend that assurance, and I think this whole House has commended Sergeant Nick Bailey in what he did and how he put himself in the line of danger, just doing his job, as I'm sure he would put it. But I'm happy to give that reassurance to my honourable friend that, of course, we will work with him through Wiltshire Police and others to make sure he gets all the support that he needs. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving way. And given what he's saying about Russia's attempts to undermine our society and engage in very, very hostile acts such as the one in Salisbury, could he say a little bit about the allegations that we've heard over the weekend, particularly in the Observer, the Sunday Times and elsewhere, obviously about other Russian attempts to potentially undermine parliamentary democracy and our democracy in this country? What steps is he taking to work with other departments, notably the Treasury, DCMS, and of course the Security Service and others, to ensure that Russia isn't attempting to influence and carry out potentially illegal activities elsewhere?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can tell the honourable gentleman that the Cabinet Office, the department that's responsible for overseeing elections and looking at allegations of that type. I know that they are taking this issue seriously. I know they are also looking at intelligence and other information they're receiving alongside my department, but the two departments are working closely on this issue, and I would assure him that we are taking it very seriously indeed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, because of hostile state activity, that's why this bill provides new powers to stop, question, search and detain people at ports, airports and the Northern Ireland border to determine whether they are spies or engaged in some other type of hostile state activity. And if it's confirmed that someone is a spy, they can be refused entry, they can be deported, or other action can be taken against them. These powers will, of course, be subject to strict safeguards and robust oversight to assure that, of course, they are properly used at all times. I will. Yeah.
I thank my right honourable friend very much for giving way. Will he just confirm that this is also about reducing the risk to the UK's interests overseas from terrorism, as is the contest strategy?
Yes, I can confirm that to my honourable friend. This is the powers in this bill are designed there to help us being better protected against all types of terrorist threat, including terrorist threat from overseas, and of course from better protected against some hostile state activity. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the other provisions in the bill are about making sure that we can respond more effectively to the changing terrorist threat. Part of this is arresting, prosecuting and convicting terrorists and imprisoning them for longer, as well as a more vigorous management of those terrorists following their release from custody to prevent reoffending. The bill will enable us to do all of this, in part by closing gaps in a number of existing terrorism offences. Yes, I will.
To the Home Secretary, and before he goes too much further on, I just want to take him back to the issue of hostile states and the checks on UK borders, including the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Can he confirm what discussions he's had with the PSNI? And can he confirm that that's one of those areas where we talk about no border, frictionless as possible, but there are some checks that do need to be carried out in terms of national security and safety?
I can confirm to the honourable gentleman that the department, I myself haven't had a discussion directly with the PSNI on this, but the department has been discussing with our Northern Ireland counterparts, and I believe there have been discussions with the PSNI to make sure that the measures that we're taking here on the borders in particular have taken into account the needs of Northern Ireland. Mr Deputy Speaker, in particular, the bill will help stop terrorists exploiting the internet. We know that terrorists are using the internet and social media to spew out vile propaganda and call on others to follow their murderous lead. We know that online platforms are being used to spread hate, and we know how this enables them to try and recruit more people to join their ranks. And we know that people are being rapidly radicalised via the web. That's why this counter-terrorism bill includes measures to combat what's happening online as well as offline. For instance, the bill will make it a criminal offence to display a terrorist flag online in the same way that it is already a criminal offence to march down the high street waving one to show your support for a terrorist organisation. Provisions in the bill will also make it easier to tackle those who stream or repeatedly view extremist material online. At the moment, if someone downloads a bomb-making video, for example, from the internet, they are committing a criminal offence. However, if they watch the same video by streaming it, then they could escape prosecution. This, of course, isn't right. The bill also criminalises the repeated viewing of streaming of terrorist material online. This will close the loophole that allows some people to watch gruesome propaganda without any fear of prosecution. The bill will mean that people who repeatedly view terrorist content online could face up to 15 years behind bars. Yes, of course.
The Home Secretary giving way, he will know that I share his strong belief in taking strong action against the terrorist threat. But I'm just concerned about the wording on this clause and some of the others. So would this apply, for example, if I stream or look on YouTube at a national action video in the action that the Select Committee has been taking in order to try and get that video removed, if we watch it in the process of pursuing and pressurising YouTube to get it taken down, does that mean we are guilty of a criminal offence if we watch it more than 3 times? And I can tell the Home Secretary that they certainly left it up there for rather more than 3 times and forced us to watch it.
Mr Deputy, it's an important question from the Chair of the Select Committee, and so I want to be clear in my response. In such circumstances as she described, it would not apply. The objective clearly is to find and punish those that have terrorist intent. And there will be a reasonable excuse defence, as there is in other laws, for those that have a legitimate use, be it, for example, the Right Honourable Lady shared one example with us, but perhaps it could apply to academics, to journalists, to news organisations, and so that kind of a defence will clearly exist in the clause. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman. Yeah.
That's that point. I mean, on my more frank point of fact, I actually support many of these measures. But can I ask why 3? And I accept the definition in terms of academic research or journalist, or in case the Home Affairs Select Committee. But what happens, for example, a teenager or somebody who's perhaps got mental health problems or other things, who actually watches it more than 3 times? Do they fall into automatically the category? Is that reasonableness test still there then?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can tell the honourable gentleman, I think the objective here is to allow for the fact it's quite possible that someone could just accidentally come across such a video. They could be curious and watch it the first time, perhaps the second time. And I'm not pretending, I'm not standing here saying there's something magical about 3. It is an attempt to try and capture repeated viewing, which may then suggest that their intent in any way is not innocent. Of course, if someone was going to be prosecuted under this law, should this bill become an Act of Parliament, then that decision would be made by the evidence from the police working with the CPS, and of course, as in other sort of criminal offences of this type, the CPS would use judgment to decide whether it's in the public interest to actually prosecute. I'll give way one more time.
Why 3, and whether or not these have always got to be done in context, for example, because clearly if it's a pattern of somebody's behaviour that they're not watching one video 3 times, but it's a series of different types of videos, that's perhaps different. But I think if we're not careful, some of the people who are opponents of this bill will highlight this, that anyone who watches it 3 times is necessarily going to get prosecuted, which I know is not his intention.
Yeah. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman is right to make that point. People have already, some people already said, made similar comments, but where I think that would be incorrect is that clearly that's not the intention of the law, and there are safeguards in place. But I welcome his overall support for the bill, but that's why I think it's important to debate these issues and for Parliament to come to a collective decision on this. And I think that it is something where I'm quite open to Parliament's ideas from parliamentarians, perhaps in the committee stage, to look more closely at these provisions and make sure we've got the balance right. Yes.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and I can tell him that he has my wholehearted support in bringing this bill forward. It's one thing to go after the people that are looking at this terrorist material online. It's another thing under Clause 4 to go after the people who are publishing it online. But surely what we really need to do is get it offline as quickly as possible. Will this bill do anything to be able to shut down the internet providers that actually allow it to be put online?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'll give 2 responses to that to my honourable friend. First, he may know that separately the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport is looking at the whole issue of internet safety and potentially legislation, something I'm sure he will discuss with the House at the right time. Secondly, I actually, just last week, I was in Silicon Valley meeting with all the really large internet companies, the big communications companies in the world, and recognizing that they have done a lot, especially in the last year, to remove terrorist content, but there's still a lot more that can be done. And so, outside of this bill, those efforts will continue. And I do hope that with the meetings that I've had with them and the US Homeland Security, the Homeland Secretary had with them, that we will be able to announce in due course further measures that those companies will take to do just that. I'll give way to the honourable lady first, then I will come back. Thank you.
The Home Secretary has been generous. But can you confirm, this bill obviously talks about making it illegal to watch the streaming of the offence of this material. Is it definitely an offence for, be it YouTube or any of these platforms, to stream terrorist material?
It is not an offence for the internet companies to stream the material. Not currently, not under UK law, and that is not, this bill does not impact on that. That said, as I've just mentioned a moment to my honourable friend, is that separately the government, led through DCMS, is looking at what other further measures may need to be taken for internet safety. I'll give way.
Thank you for giving way. It's very generous.
Home Secretary mentioned that social media providers have taken lots of action, but it's my understanding that the Metropolitan Police have asked for 400 videos to be taken off YouTube that are essentially about incitement to violence. Is this bill not an appropriate vehicle to provide a power for all police authorities to compel social media providers to take down videos that are about incitement to violence?
Home Secretary. Yeah, well, first, I believe that I think the Honourable Gentleman mentioned YouTube there, and I think, if I remember the number correctly, that they have removed something like 300,000 pieces of terrorist material. But there's still a lot more that needs to be done, not just by YouTube, but many of the other internet companies. Already there exists the ability for either the government or more likely through the police or other trusted organisations to flag certain content on the internet, whether that's videos or stills or other type of content. And what we are seeing at the moment that's really so far this year is a marked improvement in the speed at which that content is being taken down. In some cases, in many cases, within the hour it's been taken down. And the Honourable Gentleman may also be interested. What has also grown considerably in taking down content is the use of machine learning. And so trying to have the right algorithms to take content down much more quickly. And I will give way in a second, but he may be interested to know for Facebook, for example, that for the first quarter of this year, they've removed some 1.9 million pieces of content, which is up some 70% on the same quarter as last year. And in many cases, the content is being removed within minutes, and in some cases, it is being removed even before it's uploaded. I'll give way.
Giving way. Further to the point that my honourable friend made, I was very concerned to hear when these companies appeared before us in the Home Affairs Select Committee that they were not routinely searching for even the basic list of all prescribed organisations. Now, I accept that some of the stuff is quite grey territory, sometimes it's not going to be picked up by machine learning, but one would expect at a very basic level they would be searching for the names of prescribed organisations. I've found multiple examples of content, including of Northern Irish terrorist organisations and others on all these platforms, which is not even being removed by the most basic checks. Why can we not compel them to do this?
I think the Honourable Gentleman makes another good point in this debate, in that I think he's right to say that many of the leading internet organisations, they weren't searching for the prescribed organisations, or certainly not all of them. Again, I think that in the last, so far this year, certainly there's been a significant improvement in that. It is something that we are monitoring ourselves, and we're in constant dialogue with those companies. I'm not going to pretend here that I think that every single one of them is doing that now, but I think there's a huge improvement in this. I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman. Yeah.
Home Secretary, I'm slightly confused about the government's direction of travel here. I think there's quite wide support across the House for action against the people who are publishing this material to get it before it's up there. And clearly the government is looking at that, and I think if the government comes forward with measures, they would get a welcome. Whereas the Home Secretary said himself, the government isn't sure about the legislation even in this bill, that the 3 clicks approach is right because it could catch innocent people. Would it not be more advisable to focus on what it would actually work, would solve the problem at root cause, and get support across the House?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, I mean, first, just to be absolutely clear, I think what he's referred to as the 3 clicks approach, or let's say the multiple viewing approach, it is absolutely the right approach. That's why it's in this bill. And from the discussions that I've already had and the Security Minister with colleagues across the House, I think it commands a wide body of support in this House, and of course it will be tested during the passage of this bill. The sort of wider issues of internet regulation, and not just applying potentially to terrorist content, but to child sexual exploitation, to serious violence, gang violence, and issues of that type. That is something that these issues taken together, these kind of harms collectively from internet content, some internet content, is something that is being looked at by the Culture Secretary, and I believe there's a consultation going on at the moment, but that's the right place to look at this, because that kind of regulation, like the Right Honourable Gentleman has just seemed to be suggesting, is not part of this bill. Now, yes, I will.
I am really sorry to labour this point with my right honourable friend, but I think it's one of the most critical aspects of defeating terrorism today is to get this content off the internet as quickly as possible, and surely the voluntary approach is better than a legislative approach. So can my right honourable friend give the House any information from his private meetings with the internet companies? Because after all, Google and Facebook and others have some of the cleverest IT writers on the planet. Surely they ought to be able to take this stuff down before it gets almost noticed by anybody.
Well, as my honourable friend knows, as I've referred to already in the House, last week I met with all the companies he's just mentioned and others, and this was the only topic that we discussed. It's very focused on terrorist content on the internet. He's right to point out, through your voluntary action and persuasion, there has been a lot that's already been achieved. All these companies understand that legislation is something that has not been ruled out. And he asked me to perhaps say a bit more about some of the newer work these companies are doing. I hesitate to do that because I think we should announce that kind of thing at the right time, because it requires international coordination. But there is a lot more work. But what I will say, there's a lot more effort going into both machine learning and also the use of artificial intelligence to help to deal with this very important issue. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I must go on. There are a number of members that wish to speak in this debate. The bill also extends the ability of police and prosecutors to bring charges for terrorist offences that are committed overseas. It is not for law enforcement agencies in this country, of course, to police the world. But if someone travels from the UK and they commit a terrorist offence abroad, it is right that they are brought to justice if they return here. This is already the case for many terrorist offences, but there are a few gaps in the coverage, and that's why this bill extends the jurisdiction of the UK courts to cover further terrorist offences that are committed abroad, including the dissemination of terrorist publications and the possession of explosives for the purposes of an act of terrorism.
Secretary very much for giving way. Why has he decided not to include the Australian scheme, the declared areas offence, whereby Australia deemed it illegal to travel to certain designated terror hotspots like Iraq and Syria? I know it's something that his minister has been looking at for some time, yet it is not part of the counter-terror bill put before the House today.
I can tell the honourable gentleman that that I think he'd call it the Australian type sort of extraterritorial offence that they've created. I am looking at just that, and there's a bit more work to do on it. It's not as straightforward as it might sound. Obviously, if it is brought forward as a legislative proposal, I want to make sure that we have looked at it properly, and if it's something that I'm persuaded by and can complete the work on in time, I intend to bring it forward potentially as a government amendment to this bill. Yeah.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving way, and he has my support in the thrust of this bill. But in terms of matters like the one that's just been raised in that intervention, would you reassure me that he'd be very much looking to ensure there was exemptions and defences around quite legitimate purposes? So, for example, we didn't get into arguments about whether an aid worker had crossed a particular line when they were there on matters that none of us would view should be criminal.
Yes, I can absolutely give my honourable friend that assurance. As with many of these types of measures, there's always the need to consider what I would call like a reasonable excuse defence. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, once we have brought terrorists to justice and secured their conviction by a jury, we want to make sure that the public are protected by locking up the terrorist offenders for longer and allowing more robust supervision on their release. The punishment for terrorists must properly reflect the severity of their crime. That's why the bill allows for the introduction of longer sentences of up to 15 years for a number of offences, including the collecting of terrorist information, encouragement of terrorism, and decimation of terrorist publications. Previously, the maximum sentence was up to 10 years for these kinds of offences, but as well as increasing the maximum length of sentences, we need to ensure that terrorist offenders are not released from custody until it is safe to do so. When they are released, they need to be subject to longer periods of supervision on licence. The bill achieves this by enabling the courts to impose a public protection sentence for a wider range of terrorism offences. This means that offenders will not be released automatically at the halfway point of their sentence, but will instead stay in prison until the parole board decides to release them. We are also extending sentencing provisions to Northern Ireland that already operate in the rest of the United Kingdom. I know that the level of sentences that have been handed down by the courts in Northern Ireland has been of particular concern to some honourable members, and this bill will help to address this. The bill will also make it easier to monitor terrorist offenders once they have been released by requiring them to notify the police of their bank or passport details and any vehicles that they may possess or have access to. I'll give way here.
The Home Secretary again giving way, and I support the measures which he's outlining. And in, I think, his briefing documents he sent prior to this, he referred to it being similar to sex offenders monitoring in the community. In those cases, there's clear joint working between the probation service and police at local level. Is he envisaging a similar type of system for monitoring those that have been convicted of terrorism offences?
Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker, I am. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, the bill will update the law relating to terrorism reinsurance. The attack last year on Borough Market highlighted a gap in the current arrangements which the bill now addresses. And I want to, in particular, thank the Honourable Member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark for the important work that he has done on this issue on behalf of his constituents. Mr Deputy Speaker, next Tuesday will mark the anniversary of the attack outside the Finsbury Park Islamic Centre last year. Our thoughts are with the family and friends of Mr Makram Ali, who died on that day a year ago. Just as they are with the victims and the survivors of other attacks last year in Westminster, in the Manchester Arena, in London Bridge and in Parsons Green. We cannot turn back the clock to undo what has been done in those 5 attacks. But we can and we must learn the lessons and do everything in our power to prevent such suffering from being inflicted ever again. This bill plays an important part in ensuring that this House does just this. I commend it to the House.
Yeah. The question is that the bill now be read a second time. The Right Honourable Diane Abbott.
Mr Deputy Speaker, in 2017, as the House has heard, the UK was subject to 5 terrorist attacks which killed 36 people, injured many more and terrified millions. Furthermore, there was a shocking assassination attempt on Sergei and Yulia Skripal. So, it is reasonable that the government should review and, if necessary, update counter-terrorism legislation and arrangements for border security. But first, I want to pay tribute to the survivors and the bereaved of the terrorist atrocities in London and Manchester last year. Those young girls at the Manchester Arena who came to see their favourite singer saw sights that children of that age should never have to see. I also want to pay tribute to all the brave women and men of the emergency service who often run into danger and who step forward in these dreadful times. And we should not forget the NHS workers, together with support from Porton Down, who were confronted with circumstances that they could never have dreamt of, but saved the lives of Sergei and Yulia Skripal. But I turn now to the legislation before us. Let me begin by saying that I agree with the Home Secretary when he said recently that there is no binary choice between security and liberty. What makes us free is often what makes us safe, and it is certainly what makes this a country and a way of life worth serving and worth defending. And I'm not just saying this as a member of Her Majesty's opposition. I fought infringements of our civil liberties together with some of his cabinet colleagues when a Labour government was trying to introduce them, notably ID cards and 90 days detention without trial. So I defend civil liberties without fear or favour. But the question arises, is this bill necessary? Is it appropriate? And is it proportionate? A careful examination of the bill, although overall we support it, that will show that it does not necessarily meet all of these criteria. And that is the reason we will be seeking to amend sections of this bill in committee. The Home Secretary will be aware that the Home Affairs Select Committee said all the way back in 2001, this country has more anti-terrorist legislation on its statute books than almost any other developed democracy. In 2008, Lord Lloyd of Berwick, in The Other Place, said, no other country in the world has had anything like the same plethora of anti-terrorism legislation that we have had. And more recently, here is what Max Hill QC, the independent reviewer of counter-terror legislation, had to say last year. Britain has the laws we need. We should review them and ensure they remain fit for purpose. But we should have faith in our overall legal structures rather than trying to create some kind of new situation where ordinary rules are thrown out. So to the extent that this legislation doesn't throw out the ordinary rules, it has our broad support. Finally, in relation to expert opinion, I want to turn to Dave Anderson QC's review of the terrorist incidents last year in Manchester and in London. Dave Anderson made a series of recommendations. They range from multi-agency working, greater intelligence sharing, more consistent handling of intelligence. However, there was not a single recommendation for new laws and powers. But we have this new legislation in front of us. Her Majesty's opposition broadly supports the bill, but I will set out our reservations. First of all, it updates offences in a way that potentially criminalises information seeking, playing of videos and so on, and expressions of opinion. In relation to playing of videos, he will heard the opinions of my honourable friends about this issue of 3 times being a particularly significant number, and this is something that we will seek to clarify in committee. But on the question of expressing opinion, the Home Office says in its notes on the bill that it is not making it an unlawful act to hold a private view in support of a terrorist organisation. The Home Office also says that operational experience has shown that there is a gap around individuals who make statements expressing their own support for terrorist organisations, but who stop short of expressly inviting others to do so. The Home Secretary will expect that we will press this point in committee, because we would say that the gap between having an opinion, a personal opinion, and inciting others to unlawful acts is not an anomaly, it's an important principle in protecting freedom of speech. We're in danger in this legislation of confusing bad thoughts with bad deeds, but we hope to clarify this issue as the bill goes through the House. Our other concern about the bill is the extent to which it allows retention of biometric data for anyone arrested, whether they are mistakenly or even unlawfully arrested. This includes DNA and fingerprints. There are already abuses of the National Police Database, which the government has failed to correct. It is my view the state has no business keeping records on people who are not criminals. It's an essential part of our liberty that we can go about our day-to-day lives unhindered by state agency. This is not the case if the state is able to retain data on all of us. It is even a greater breach of our civil liberties if this retention is done without our knowledge. Our further concern about this bill is what it has to say in relation to the PREVENT strategy. The bill proposes extending the PREVENT strategy by allowing, as well as the police, local authorities to refer people to the PREVENT programme. On the question of PREVENT, let me be clear. There will always be the need for a programme which does what Prevent purports to do. I've met Commissioner Neil Basu and other Metropolitan Police leads on Prevent. I visited Prevent-funded programmes in Birmingham and elsewhere, and I have no doubt that there is some good work being done in the name of Prevent. But Prevent as a whole is a tainted brand, particularly among sections of the Muslim community. And most recently we know from a recent study by the Behavioural Insights team, which was commissioned by the Home Office itself, that more than 95% of de-radicalisation programmes are ineffective. I would suggest the fact that Prevent is a tainted brand and that so many of the de-radicalisation programmes are ineffective, those two facts are not unrelated. Labour is committed to a thorough review of the Prevent programme, which we believe is currently not fit for purpose. And in the interest of transparency and accurate evidence-based policy making, I'm calling on the Home Secretary today to publish the research from the Behavioural Insights team, which has been so widely reported and seems to run counter to the claims made for the success of these programmes. But now, the government is proposing to add...
I hadn't intended to intervene at this stage, and I'll speak at length later, but is she aware that about 75% of people who refer to Prevent are of no further interest to the police or security services having been through the programme? That sounds like success to me.
Just to advise people that you may want to speak at length later, can I advise all members up to 15 minutes and no more? Diana.
I have accepted that I've visited Prevent programmes and I'm aware good work is being done, but I think this figure that 95% of de-radicalisation programmes are not effective should not be put to one side. We have to address that, and we have to address whether there is any connection at all with the fact that Prevent is a tainted brand amongst members of some communities.
I read I think my honourable friend's making a fair... I think we need some sort of Prevent strategy, and therefore I accept the need to review it. Isn't it the fact that given that over 6,000 individuals were referred through the Prevent strategy, over half of whom were under 20, shows how careful we do need to be in actually pursuing this, even if it is the right policy for the government to have?
I do accept the need for a programme which does what Prevent purports to do, but there's a danger in if we don't review the activities of Prevent, it may prove to be counterproductive with the very communities we want to work with. As for the question of local authorities becoming referral agents, at least the police have had some training in this matter, whatever we think of the programme, but local authorities have no expertise in issues around counter-terrorism. So the danger is that the rate of pointless referrals and, I'm afraid, what seem to be useless de-radicalisation counselling will snowball. And finally...
Could I just ask to clarify, I'm listening carefully to what you say, is it that she would review the Prevent strategy, or given the data or allegations that she has repeated from, I think she said, a lawyer, would it be to press the pause button on Prevent, stop it and reinvent something else? If it's the latter, what is the something else? I think it strikes to the point made by her honourable friend for Gedling.
I said quite clearly that we would seek to review it. You could not at this point press the pause button, but I think the data we have about the effectiveness of the de-radicalisation programmes and what we know about how it's regarded in some parts of the community means that we would want to review it. So, one of the most worrying aspects of the bill is the creation of powers of detention, interrogation, search or seizure without any suspicion of crime whatsoever, but simply while crossing borders. This is to treat anyone, British citizen or not, as a potential terrorist simply in the act of crossing the border. These types of powers should only be granted with due care. all inhibitions on the rights of the citizen by the state must be based on evidence or reasonable grounds for suspicion. It must be subject to challenge, if the House will allow me to conclude my remarks. If suspicion-free detention, interrogation and search is allowed, then it cannot be challenged. If there is no basis for challenge, there is likely no basis for detention. And how does this all accord with the government's claim to be building a new global Britain?
General of MI5, Andrew Parker, said in a speech in October last year that the ongoing terrorist threat was operating at a scale and pace we've not seen before. Does her party support this bill in principle or not?
I think I've said 3 times that we broadly support this bill in principle, but we are Her Majesty's opposition, and we are entitled at second reading to set out what our reservations are. So before leaving the content of this bill, let me say this. There is much in the bill about increasing sentences for terrorism-related activity. But I would say quite seriously to the Home Secretary that he also needs to look at what more could be done about guarding against radicalisation in prison. I know there's been a certain amount done in terms of trying to put imams and so on separately from other prisons, but the fact is that too many men, not of a Muslim background, get caught up in extremist ideology whilst behind bars. We cannot continue to have a situation that people emerge from prison more radicalised than when they went in.
To that point, does the Right Honourable Lady agree with me that we should be concerned by reports which emerged from Belgium that the suspect in the appalling and brutal murder of 2 police officers was a small-time crook who it appears had been radicalised in custody? Does she therefore agree that she should be supporting the government in all its excellent efforts to try to deal with that important point?
I think members are seeking to have me say what they want me to say. And not listening to my speech. What I'm saying is that it's all very well and good to put more people in prison for longer, but there is more we could do about radicalisation in prison. Because it is shocking to me to see young men who had no connection with Islam before going into prison come out of prison Islamic radicals. And that is something we can do something about, because whilst they're in prison, they're in the hands of the state. And I think there is more that can be done. In Dave Anderson's review, he called for greater collaboration between counter-terrorism police, MI5, and the neighbourhood police. But, and I make no apologies for repeating this, the government has cut police numbers by 21,000. Their cuts have, in practice, undermined Dave Anderson's recommendations. You can't have greater collaboration between counter-terrorism police and neighbourhood police if the numbers of neighbourhood police are being cut. The Metropolitan Police Commander, Cressida Dick, has said coping with counter-terrorism is putting an unsustainable strain on the police. The head of the National Police Chief Council, Sarah Thornton, has said fewer officers and police community support officers will cut off the intelligence that is so crucial to preventing attacks. New laws, whatever their merit, are no substitute for effective policing, and not just counter-terrorism police. Ministers will tell us how much more they're spending on counter-terrorism, but almost as important as actual counter-terrorism officers is ordinary neighbourhood policing, which is our front line against terrorism. In fact, laws, whatever their merit, become a dead letter without enough police officers.
I completely agree with my honourable friend on this point, and we're very lucky in Wales, thanks to the investment from the Welsh Labour government, that we still have substantial numbers of PCSOs on our streets who play a crucial role. But all the police officers I talk to and senior police officers I speak to are telling me about the very real pressures and strains that they face and the impact that has, that lack of community policing, on that front line in the fight against terrorism.
I agree with my honourable friend, and this is something that we are hearing from police leaders all the time. They want to do their very best against terrorism, but the officers puts them under a great deal of strain. So, broadly and in principle, we support this bill, but as the Home Secretary would expect, we will be giving the bill particularly careful scrutiny in committee. We hope it will come out of committee a better bill. The safety of the nation depends on it.
Before I bring the next speaker in, just to remind me, I've told speakers it's a very important debate, so please let's not abuse other people's times. John Hayes, up to 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Terrorism blights lives, and in some cases, of course, it takes lives. We've heard already in this debate from both sides of the House about the appalling events of the last year. They will be in all of our minds as we debate these measures. The Right Honourable Lady was right to focus on the events in Manchester, not because any terrorist event is greater or less than any other, but because of that chilling image of those children, which she rightly focused on in her remarks. Now, it's not just, however, the people whose lives are lost. It's the fact that all of us are affected by terrorism, those who relate to those who died, those in their communities, those in the wider network of people who came into contact with those events. The emergency services have been mentioned, and others. But actually all of us are a little diminished, aren't we, when these things happen in our country. Fear is spread, doubt is fueled. That's part of the aim of the terrorists, of course, to intimidate us, to change us, to frighten us. And it's right to say that in our response we must be mindful of the need to retain those freedoms that the terrorists seek to extinguish. Nevertheless, it's equally true that we must ensure that we're well equipped to deal with terrorists as they change their modus operandi. Two things have altered most about terrorism in recent times. The first is the ability of terrorists to communicate their message using modern methods, to proselytise, to convert, to recruit. They do that by messages and they do it by images. And of course, modern media is such that it can be done much more easily than in years gone by. And they are ruthless and merciless in the way they go about that business. When I was at the Home Office as the Minister responsible for security, I was well aware of the good work that's done in government to deal with that. But it is a constant challenge. Every day images are put up and every day they're countered, or we aim to get them taken off the internet. They only have to be there for a very short time indeed to have their effect, or their possible effect, as they're suggested by vulnerable people. The Honourable Lady talked about those young people that are referred to the PREVENT strategy, and I want to return to that in a moment. But of course, these young people that are in particular at the greatest risk. They're impressionable, they're vulnerable, they may just simply be lonely, they may be in need. And the terrorist acts much like any other kind of social or cultural predator. They recruit by corrupting. They seek to own that young person. And once they own them, they direct them to wicked purpose. So this is, there are parallels with other kinds of corruption. They are recruited in the same way as sexual predators recruit people. They are groomed. We know this from the evidence that's been brought before this House, from the work of select committees, and of course from the Home Office itself. And the Secretary of State is absolutely right to say that it is not only our responsibility, it is our duty to ensure that all of those missions to keep those young people and others safe are best equipped to do so, both by their training and their skills, but also by the legislation which underpins the work they do. And successive governments have recognised that over time. Indeed, it is a sad strength of this country that we have more experience of dealing with terrorism than most others because of the events in Northern Ireland. that knowledge, that understanding of terrorism, has allowed us to develop skills which other countries don't always have. It's, say, a matter of sadness that we should have had to do so. But nonetheless, those have to be updated. They have to be refined over time. For the other principal change with terrorism is that terrorists have become more flexible. Countering terrorism is largely about trying to anticipate events. The contest strategy is about prevention, it's about anticipation as well as being about response. And anticipated events is in essence rooted in the idea that you can measure patterns of behaviour, likely courses of action. When terrorists become less predictable, they are harder to counter, and they have become less predictable over time, as the more recent terror events show. Use of vehicles, for example, as a weapon. It sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? It's horrible, of course, in its effect. But once you know that you merely need a vehicle rather than a bomb, and vehicles are routine things that can be obtained without too much fuss or bother, you know also that you can, with that weapon, go about your deadly business, as we saw in Westminster and elsewhere. So that additional flexibility, that new approach by the terrorists, requires laws that are fit for purpose, laws that allow us to respond to the changing character of terrorism, and that's what's being brought before the House today. I was pleased as Minister to be able to bring the Investigatory Powers Bill, now the Act, to the House. It was very challenging because, of course, questions were asked about it. The Honourable Lady spoke about scrutiny and spoke about the role of the opposition. She knows that the opposition and I worked very closely together on that bill. The government made key changes as the bill made its way through the House because we recognised that actually part of the role of the opposition is to challenge government and oblige government to question itself about the appropriateness of various aspects of what it's proposing. We ended up, I think, with a good piece of legislation which has further enabled the security services and the police to go about their business, not just in respect of terrorism, but in respect of serious and organised crime as well. This bill is very much in the same spirit. It updates the legislative basis on which our security services and the police can do their work by recognising the changes in the pattern of behaviour of those we face. Now, the Secretary of State went through the detail of the legislation, and I have it all here, but to do so would both be tedious and, I suspect, test your patience, given the overture at the beginning of this debate that many wanted to speak and none should do so for too long. But, yes, I'll have to give way briefly.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He's talked about the terrorist methods continually changing.
Yes.
Didn't the situation in Northern Ireland tell us that we needed to constantly update our legislation, often by emergency legislation, to keep one step ahead of the terrorists?
Yes, that did happen. But I think I'd go as far as to say that reflecting actually what what Andrew Parker said, that the scale of what we now face and its character in modern times is unprecedented. I'm cautious about being too definitive about these things because it's never wise to be so. But I do, of course, defer to the man who runs MI5, who's closest to these matters. And I do think that we are facing new challenges of a kind we've never really seen before. If you think of Irish terrorism, back to my earlier remarks, there was, for the most part, a degree of predictability. And the key difference with terrorism then was that most of the terrorists did not want to risk their own lives. They wanted to save the lives of the operatives. That is a very fundamental difference, the sort of terrorism we've seen in more recent years. There are also differences about the structure of the command structure of terrorism in Ireland compared with what we now face. Of course, many of the terrorists that we are seeking to counter and that this legislation addresses are people who've been radicalised in their own home. They are inspired rather than part of some organised network. And given what I said about the availability of weapons, and a vehicle can be just that, you can imagine what the damage that an inspired terrorist, unknown to the security services, possibly in the police, until the point at which they commit the act, the damage that they might do. I'm going to give away, but I do want to conclude fairly quickly.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Would he not also agree that one of the acute differences between Irish terrorism and the threats that we receive today is that more often than not in the Irish situation, an agreed code word would be used to alert the security services that something was about to kick off and happen? We don't have that. That is why this very flexible, proactive approach to the regulations which are required to try and keep us safe, not in all circumstances, but to do our damnedest to do so, is absolutely pivotal.
The Irish people endured the horror of terrorism for a very, very long time indeed, and we shouldn't be complacent about any part of our kingdom. But I do think that there are differences with what we face now, as I've already said, and no doubt others will elaborate upon during the course of these remarks. I just want to, before coming to the very end of this brief speech, certainly brief by my standards, to just deal with Prevent. Now, I worked with Prevent, may I just say two things that the Right Honourable Lady said that I fully agree with, and then I'll deal with the things I didn't. It's a polite thing to do. She's absolutely right about radicalisation in prisons. I think no government has got this right. It's not easy to get right. I mean, in a previous incarnation, I was the minister responsible for prison education, would you believe? And that's not an easy job, I can tell you. And I was never really satisfied that we got that right. And I don't think the previous government did either. I don't think this is about party politics. I think probably we need to look at that afresh. I agree with her about that. It is a good thing to keep people in prison longer, by and large, who do dreadful things. And that's my view. But she's quite right to say that if you're keeping them in prison ever longer, with a serious chance they're going to be radicalised accordingly, there's a real risk they might do a degree in being radicalised rather than just an A-level. I'm inclined to her view, actually, that that's something that we need to look at with even greater determination than I know has been done in the past. And with this Home Secretary in place and this Security Minister, we've got the best chance ever, I think, of bringing fresh eyes to these circumstances. Proust, I think, said that there's no such thing as new landscapes, only such thing as new eyes to see them, and perhaps in a Proustian fashion, my right honourable friend will look at what the honourable lady has suggested. The second thing I agree with the honourable lady about is the need to ensure that there is proper oversight of Prevent and that we measure its effect properly. When I was the minister, I revitalised the Oversight Board in the Home Office, and I'm sure that my successor has added even greater value than I could have possibly hoped to in that respect. And I was also determined that we measured the effect of Prevent more routinely and more transparently, actually. Nonetheless, I just disagree with her about Prevent as a concept. The work done by our Prevent coordinators at the very front line of radicalisation is heroic. I met them time and time again all over the country. I went around the country to see what the channel operation was like and the channel panels. And the people that contribute to channel and the people who coordinate and run Prevent are doing immensely good work in very difficult circumstances. I don't say they always get it right, perhaps they don't. But I do say that without them, the circumstances we face would be altogether worse. They are making a huge difference in towns and cities across the country, day by day, and I celebrate their achievements, whilst never being uncritical, as I've described, about measurement and oversight.
grateful for the right honourable gentleman giving way. Did he meet any representatives of Muslim communities who perceive it to be a flawed scheme?
I think there is an argument about the way Prevent's perceived, the way that communities in which those coordinators operate understand Prevent. There is an argument for promoting Prevent more effectively. I'll meet him halfway there. But let's not forget that some of the critics of Prevent are the people who don't want it to work. Absolutely. Some of the critics of Prevent are critics because they don't believe in what we're trying to achieve. So you have to start from the perspective that not everyone is a balanced and reasoned critic, and it's to some extent coloured by that. I introduced the Prevent duty when I was the Minister, so that local authorities and health authorities and schools and colleges and others could add value to Prevent by doing their work in identifying those people most at risk. These are people at risk of being groomed to do wicked things. Let's be clear. So with that, Madam Deputy Speaker, to give others a chance to speak far more persuasively than I could ever hope to, no. I end by saying this. Our will in respect of terrorism must never falter. Our resolve must never waver. We must have the same kind of certain confidence that our security services and police have in their certain determination, their mission to defeat terrorism.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the right honourable member for South Holland and Deepings, who made some thoughtful remarks, but who inexplicably failed to stick to his 15-minute time limit, which is a surprise to all of us in the chamber. But I'm pleased to follow him nonetheless. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the last couple of years, we've seen deadly terrorist attacks all across the world, including in Mosul, Baghdad, Istanbul, Kabul, New York, Paris, Nice, Munich, Stockholm, and last year the UK was subject to 5 terrorist attacks in London and Manchester, which killed 36 innocent victims and injured many, many more. Now, we may have honourable disagreements about many aspects of this bill, but we owe it to the people who were affected by last year's attacks to debate these differences as a matter of principle and efficacy, rather than based on petty party political interests. Glasgow Airport, in my constituency, was also a target of an attempted terror attack in 2007, coming as a huge shock to all Scots, given the fact that we have very little experience in dealing with terrorist acts on Scottish soil. But this proved that nowhere and no one is immune from the threat of terrorism. It's with that in mind that I can assure the Minister and this House that the SNP will engage in this debate in the appropriate manner, treating it with the respect and seriousness that it deserves. In an increasingly changing and digital world, the SNP supports giving law enforcement agencies the necessary powers to fight serious crime and terrorism. The world is becoming ever more complex, and terrorists are utilising sophisticated measures to plan their attacks. As such, it's of extreme importance that we keep our response and policies to this under continual review to ensure that we are taking the most effective action possible to prevent terrorist acts from occurring, whilst crucially at the same time respecting and upholding our civil liberties. During the debates that will follow, the SNP will judge any proposed new powers or extensions of existing ones as to whether they are appropriate, effective, proportionate and respectful of civil liberties. This is an approach that we adopted during the passage of the Investigative Powers Act, during which my honourable and learned friend, the member for Edinburgh South West, and I argued that aspects of the bill were unlawful. Now, we may have been defeated in this place, but we were not alone, and successful court challenges by the honourable and right honourable members for West Bromwich East and Halton Price and Howden, and subsequently Liberty, proved that we were right to oppose these measures. I hope that the Government has learned from that experience and worked with all parties. I will do, yeah.
I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the honourable gentleman given. Just to clarify on that point about the Investigatory Powers Act, I think it's important for the House to know that in the legal challenge brought, the Government was successful in defending that Act on about 3 out of 4 measures. It was the simple measure, one of the measures about judicial oversight, which we conceded on, and that is what you'll see in this bill as well. I
appreciate the Minister's intervention, but as outlined by my honourable friend made those points during the committee stage of the bill. But I accept the Minister's point. But in that case, I do hope they have learned the lesson from that, and will work with all parties to ensure that we have a policy that will survive any potential legal challenge and can carry the support of this House. So no petty opposition for opposition's sake, but we will cast a critical eye and will bring forward amendments to improve the bill in committee and report stage. Now, following the London Bridge attack last year, the Prime Minister announced the review of the contest strategy to assess whether the police and security forces have the powers they need to tackle those who would seek to cause us harm. Now, following David Anderson's very thorough review, this bill aims to bolster the government's counter-terrorism approach and strengthen a variety of measures to respond to the terrorist threat, allowing earlier intervention to disrupt terrorism. Now, at the outset, I agree with the Government's desire to intervene at an early stage. This is not only effective for stopping terrorist attacks, but is also helpful in preventing young people from becoming radicalised. Terrorist organisations are using 21st century measures, including social media, to promote the propaganda as a means to radicalise youngsters. It's only right that the Government reviews its approach to ensure it is fit for the 21st century and future-proofed as far as is practically possible. But the internet providers and the social media companies also have a responsibility in ensuring that terrorists cannot exploit their systems to promote their poisonous agenda. They must be involved in this process too. Too many times we've seen providers slow and unwilling to take down terrorist content. Now, as we broadly support the aims of this bill, some of the measures will attract our support, but others will need to be tested at committee stage. We have to ensure that lowering thresholds and the burden of proof does not become so low that it severely impinges on civil liberties. The bill seeks to amend the offence of collecting terrorist information to cover the repeated viewing or streaming of material online. I accept the point that streaming material has become far more common since the previous legislation was drafted, and we need a more robust approach in this area. But the implementation of this particular policy will give power to our police and security services to compel internet companies to assist them in carrying out covert surveillance on suspects streaming terror-related content. But the process, how this process is set in motion, is key. In committee, the Government will need to set out its case very well as to the proposed definition of streaming and the new 3 strikes, 3 clicks approach for people who stream extremist terror content. The Honourable Member for North Durham already pressed the Home Secretary on this point earlier in the debate. This approach in all likelihood may be oversimplistic, and while we are sympathetic to the Government's goal of early prevention of potential terrorist acts, we must ensure that these proposals are evidence-based and that civil liberties are not eroded or forgotten in the process. Like others who have intervened, I feel the Government should be doing a lot more to stop the material at source by putting a statutory duty on the online platforms which this material is viewed on. The Government's intention that the offence will cover situations where the defendant is in control of a computer, but in addition, and with a much higher degree of difficulty, also situations where an individual was viewing the material, for example, over the controller's shoulder. This aspect may prove impossible and is one obvious aspect where parts of the bill, as drafted, may be open to challenge in court if passed unamended. Campaigners have already voiced concerns about this proposed policy, suggesting that it is unfair, it unfairly targets innocent people. Rachel Robertson from Liberty said that blurring the boundary between thought and action by locking people up simply for exploring ideas undermines the foundations of our criminal justice system. Terrorists' primary goal is to undermine our freedom. With proposals like this, the Government risks giving them exactly what they want. Now, we, along with the Scottish Government, will work with the Minister to ensure that this is not the case and that we get this important part of the bill right. They've also pointed out an attempt to introduce a similar terror streaming law in France last year was struck down twice. Now, in summing up, I would be keen to learn what discussions the Minister has had with his counterparts in France about their experience of trying to introduce a similar law and whether they've been able to learn any lessons from them. Now, the Home Secretary also seeks to amend the offence of encouragement of terrorism so that action can be taken to target those who seek to radicalise children or young people who may not understand what they've been encouraged to do. It is vital that we reassess our approach to preventing vulnerable youngsters from becoming radicalised, but in doing so, sending a clear message to the recruiters that you will face the full hand of the law if you attempt to prey on our young people. Indeed, in my role in the Justice Select Committee, I had a long conversation with a now convicted terrorist, which has had a profound effect on me, and in particular my thoughts on how we try and protect young people from terrorist influence online. Now, I appreciate the arguments we've heard that certain provisions in this bill unfairly target innocent individuals' personal liberty. The fact that the Home Office guidance that accompanies this bill also accepts this point is telling. However, it attempts to clarify the concerns by stating it would not be unlawful to hold a private view in support of a terrorist organisation, only to recklessly express those views with the risk others could be influenced. On this point, and I think in committee, the government will need to clarify what is meant by recklessly expressing a particular view. It seems an unnecessarily wide and vague phrase that will undoubtedly be tested at later stages of this bill. There will always be a fine balance between giving the police, security service and the judiciary enough powers to keep us safe and liberty itself. Ultimately, if we overly restrict our personal freedoms, then it could be argued that terrorists have won already. The government has to tread very carefully and fully engage with not only the opposition and the Scottish Government and other devolved administrations, but those who instinctively oppose any perceived restrictions on liberty. The Scottish Government supports giving law enforcement and the intelligence services the necessary and proportionate powers that are required to fight terrorism. In the past, the UK Government has chosen not to engage with the Scottish Government prior to publishing bills and guidelines on this issue. I am pleased that this has not been the case this time, and I welcome the phone call I had with the Minister last week. However, can I seek an assurance from the Minister that he will engage with the Scottish Government at every opportunity and throughout this process? Keeping people safe is the primary function of any government, and through the Prevent strategy, the Scottish Government will continue to work with key partners to tackle all forms of violent extremism, including through Police Scotland's model of community engagement. Through working with the Scottish Government, lessons can be learned about the range of positive work that Police Scotland and other agencies do within their local communities to keep people safe. The distinct Scottish approach on Prevent delivery benefits from the positive relationships fostered within our communities. This includes our work to develop a range of credible grassroots community-led projects which help challenge extremist narratives, providing support and guidance to those individuals potentially vulnerable to radicalisation. Yes, sir.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. The description he's just given of the distinct Scottish approach to Prevent sounds exactly like what Prevent is supposed to do. Can he just elaborate more on why the Scottish Prevent, which apparently he fully supports, unlike the Labour front bench, is different to what happens in England?
For the intervention, I think it's a resource even issue. In Scotland, the resources are put in to ensure that that community engagement is there and is happening, and there's support in the community for the actual policy, whereas that is perhaps not the case south of the border at the moment.
If you wouldn't mind. Thank you. But so he has no issue at all. There is no difference whatsoever between English Prevent and Scottish Prevent. It is purely a resource issue, and therefore he does not share the Labour front bench's view that it should be changed.
Well, I have to say to the honourable member, I'm no expert in the delivery of the Prevent strategy in England. I represent a Scottish constituency. I'm here talking on behalf of the SNP. It's distinct in its success. It's distinct in its success compared to the strategy as it currently operates south of the border. I've already outlined in what way. The Scottish Government recognises that resilient communities which look out for one another is key to keeping people safe. Furthermore, that communities are actually our greatest ally in doing so. This bill has to ensure that the provisions laid out take account of the separate and distinct Scottish legal system, respecting the current devolution settlement, and are proportionate and appropriate for Scotland. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I nearly get through an entire speech without mentioning it, but a potential threat to our national security is, of course, Brexit and the multilateral information sharing tools that we face losing access to. Organised crime and terrorism do not respect borders, and it's essential that Police Scotland can continue accessing the information systems, support and technical expertise available through Europol, not only to help Scotland safe, keep Scotland safe, but also to contribute to making Europe more safe through cross-border collaboration. I feel that after the UK leaves the EU, there is a major risk that any new arrangements that are put in place will be suboptimal to those at present. I would like to hear a guarantee from the Minister that any new legislation will be prepared in time to fill any gaps arising from leaving the EU and as much as possible, how he intends to do so. We need to ensure that our law enforcement agencies can continue to have the same level of access to Europol as they currently enjoy. Madam Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, 2017 was a difficult year for the UK, and we owe it to everyone affected by last year's attacks to work together on this vitally important bill to give our law enforcement agencies the necessary and proportionate powers to eliminate and prevent terrorism without eroding vital civil liberties.
Alex Chalk.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman from Paisley and Renfrewshire North. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, we meet in the shadow of a grim situation for our country. As we've already heard, in 2017, 36 people killed, as the Shadow Home Secretary indicated. And since 2013 alone, some 25 terrorist plots foiled. And I want to take this opportunity just to pay tribute to those of my constituents at GCHQ who, through their hard work, dedication and professionalism, I feel sure have contributed to the foiling of a good number of those plots, both here in the UK and overseas. And I am able to say this afternoon that I entirely support the Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill, but it is absolutely right, and it is indeed the duty of the opposition and all backbenchers to scrutinise these matters with great care. And I sense the same spirit in this House this evening as there was in the Investigatory Powers Bill, for there to be constructive discussion and at times criticism to ensure that those provisions that we arrive at are necessarily ones that strike that balance between liberty and security. And I remember being in this House, listening to the Investigatory Powers Bill, and I'm entirely sure that the end statute was better for the process of debate that took place in this House. But I want to take a few moments to look at some of the provisions and explain why, in my view, this draft bill is appropriate. In simple terms, the bill serves to clarify existing measures. Second, to extend in a common-sense way their provisions. And third, in appropriate circumstances, to modestly strengthen penalties. And I'm going to go through the three headings and explain why, in my view, these provisions can be justified. First, on clarification. This bill seeks to clarify that the existing offence of displaying in a public place an image which arouses reasonable suspicion that the person is a member or supporter of a prescribed organisation covers the display of images online as well as in the analogue world. Well, that seems to me to be appropriate. It clarifies the position, and to have otherwise would make a nonsense of the digital world we're in. So I anticipate that that won't be controversial at committee. But I want to deal with this point that the Honourable Lady, the Shadow Home Secretary, sought to raise, this business about extending the offence of inviting support for a prescribed organisation to cover expressions of support that are reckless as to whether they will encourage others to support the organisation. So the concern has been raised that moving the mens rea, as it's called, from intention to mere recklessness risks broadening the ambit of the offence too greatly. Well, first thing I would say is it's absolutely right to have this discussion, because if we were to inadvertently broaden an offence so that it unintentionally caught people within it that were not comfortable catching within it, well, that would be a matter of grave concern. But having thought about it, it's my view, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this is on the right side of the line, and I'll explain why. Supposing the facts were as follows, that the defendant deliberately went round to his friend's house from school and he said, look, I really think you should be joining this prescribed organisation, be it ISIS or Al-Mahajirun. And his intention was to get that individual to sign up. But in the room at the same time was his friend's younger brother, aged 16. And he wasn't in any way intending for that younger brother to be radicalised, but he was being reckless as to whether it should take place. Now, in those circumstances, if the message was in fact heard by the younger brother rather than the contemporary friend, is it really the case that the law should have this loophole so that the defendant couldn't be liable in those circumstances? No, that would, in a moment, that would be a nonsense, and it would be to create as I say, a loophole that would be unconscionable, because the mischief to which the legislation is aimed at is the propagating of propaganda material which encourages others to support prescribed organisations. I'll give way.
We should be debating these issues, but where can he point to in the statute books where there's, and in case law, where there's real development of the concept of recklessness compared to the concept of intentionality?
Everywhere. I'll give you, the Honourable Gentleman, a case in point. How about an allegation of assault? Supposing the defendant goes out, and I can just explain the point, because he's asked me a question, so I'll try and answer it. Supposing the defendant goes out in the High Street in Kingston, in his constituency, with a baseball bat, and he starts swinging it around outside the pub, being reckless as to whether someone will be struck by that baseball bat. Well, if he does recklessly strike someone to the jaw, and that person has a fractured jaw, the defendant can and will, in those circumstances, be convicted of Section 20 offence of assault of grievous bodily harm. So the law does recognise that where there is recklessness, that can be sufficient mens rea for a large number, in fact, probably even the majority of offences against the person. So to that extent, all this would do is make sure the new legislation actually chimes with existing legislation. The second offence that I wish to deal with is another point which properly has been discussed, namely updating the offence of obtaining information likely to be useful to a terrorist to be extended to cover terrorist material that is just viewed or streamed over the internet rather than downloaded to form a permanent record. Well, first of all, we need to consider what is this material we're talking about? Well, it could well be, for example, digital copies of Inspire, that's an online publication produced by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, what does this material contain? Well, one example, one edition contains instructions about how to make a bomb using household materials. So these are step-by-step instructions how to manufacture an improvised explosive device with materials that you could buy in a hardware store and in a regular supermarket. Extremely serious and dangerous material if it gets into the wrong hands. How about another example of what is published in these online magazines? Instructions as how to wreak the maximum amount of destruction using a vehicle in a crowded area. So this is the sort of material that we're talking about. Now, at the moment, if it has to be downloaded, it creates a ridiculous loophole, does it not? Because it means that an individual who chooses to view this pernicious content by simply restreaming it could somehow find themselves outside the net. That would be ridiculous, particularly as every time one of these items is streamed, it will create digital artifacts on the computer as well. So an individual who downloads it, who has the full digital content on their computer, is liable to be prosecuted. But an individual who keeps streaming it, notwithstanding that that leads to some digital artifacts on their computer, would somehow be outside the net. That would be truly perverse. And so, whilst it's right to say, in a moment, whilst it's right to say that we should be mindful of the risk of people coming within the ambit, so long as the defence of reasonable excuse exists, I think we can be confident as a House that that proper balance is struck. I shall give way.
I'm not a liberal on any of these issues, but I think there's a problem with this, because one issue the security services have is actually dealing with the amount of material out there and also targeting the right people. Surely, if it's somebody going to be viewed 3 times could get pulled in by this, isn't that throwing open the net rather wide for law enforcement to actually try and do that?
I don't think so. I think he's right to raise the question, but I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so is this, is because if we have a situation where we accept that an individual who decides to view this material online and then to download it onto their computer so that they can watch it at their leisure 3 times, if we accept that that is an offence, and we do because, by the way, the terrorist offences very often escalate really quite quickly from the viewing of these materials. So the first point is we accept that's an offence. Would it not be perverse to say, in circumstances where an individual, simply from their pure choice, wants to view this material 3 times, and whilst he does it, by the way, taking account of the instructions that exist within that piece of material to build a bomb or to create havoc with a vehicle, that somehow that person would be outside the law? It would just be a bizarre anomaly, and it would say more about the digital habits of that individual rather than the pernicious nature of the content. So whilst it's correct to say that this is something we should always be mindful of, in my view, the risks of doing nothing simply leave open huge loopholes which terrorists who are particularly increasingly digitally savvy can simply exploit. So this is a proportionate and appropriate step to take. I'm not going to give way on that again, if I may. I'm just going to move on to the issue of increasing the maximum penalty. So at the moment, the maximum penalty under Section 58 of the Terrorism Act is just 10 years imprisonment, and this proposes to increase it to 15 years imprisonment. I think it's important to make the point that if someone pleads guilty at the moment to being in possession of material which might be of assistance to a person planning an act of terrorism, certainly until the recent sentencing guidelines increase, that person could expect to be sentenced to just 14 or 15 months or so, released in 7 months. And what we have to recognise is when we're dealing with these kinds of offences, part of the import, part of the necessity of the legislation is to ensure that dangerous people are kept out of circulation. So it does seem to me in those particulars that this is necessary and proportionate. Otherwise, the other common sense extensions, for example, to add terrorism offences to the list of offences for which an individual can be subjected to a serious crime prevention order, that makes sense because SCPOs enable the authorities to continue to manage an individual convicted of a terrorism offence. Again, that makes perfect sense. But I think it's also important to note, in the interest of balance, that this proposed legislation does also contain protections for individuals. So, for example, it introduces a statutory bar on the admissibility as evidence in a criminal trial of oral admissions made in an examination at a port under Schedule 7 to the Terrorism Act. So it would be wrong to get the impression that this is one-way traffic. So overall then, Madam Deputy Speaker, certainly so far as Part 1 is concerned, these measures serve to clarify, they serve to extend in a way that chimes with common sense, they update the law, and they lead to a modest strengthening of penalties, which is a calibrated, proportionate, modernising approach, and one that I'm happy to support.
Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Cheltenham, and I joined the debate with the same spirit of consensus with which he began his contribution. I wish to speak exclusively to the extension of Terror Reinsurance Clause 19 in Chapter 4. Whilst it may appear in the miscellaneous provisions, this crucial clause offers a significant opportunity to protect businesses and people from future attacks, as well as to help those who have already experienced attacks. And whilst he's no longer in the chamber, I'd like to thank the Home Secretary for his kind words in opening this session about my own work over the last 12 months, because I speak as a representative of a constituency and community who were sadly attacked last year in the London Bridge and Borough Market attack on the 3rd of June. I don't wish to dwell on the barbaric or savage motives of those who attacked, but this new clause links directly to the Prime Minister and Minister's statements at the time about not letting terrorists win, and how we combat their motives and their potential to change our ways of living and working. I would like to extend my thanks to Bishop Christopher, the Bishop of Southwark, who sits in the other place here, and Dean Andrew Nunn from Southwark Cathedral, and their whole team at Southwark Cathedral, because of their efforts over the last year, but in particular for hosting such a moving commemorative service last week, focusing on the people directly affected, including the loved ones of the 8 people murdered last June and those injured, but also providing a sense of purpose for now and for the future, planting a new tree of life. Its very growth fuelled by compost from the flowers laid by well-wishers on London Bridge last year. That symbol of ongoing life and vibrance in the area is genuinely well conceived and was delivered so very sensitively last week. I'd also like to extend thanks to the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, the Home Secretary, the Shadow Home Secretary, and the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, for attending the service last week, and to Southwark Council Leader Peter John and Eleanor Kelly, the Chief Executive, for providing space on the bridge for a minute's silence and more flower laying just last week. But in the service, the sentiments of the local community came through so very strongly. The sense that we must continue living our lives, but that something had also dramatically changed. There was a community project run after the attacks for people to provide their own testimony and personal experience. And words of one local resident were echoed by the Home Secretary last week. This person said that the terror attack changed this neighbourhood forever, but not in the way the terrorists had planned. This community is going to carry on being diverse, inclusive and welcoming. And that sentiment was echoed directly when the cathedral was reopened last year after attack by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who stated that the terrorists had unwittingly created a renewed sense of community. And that is very much something that I've felt and seen in the last 12 months. My community did stand tall last year. The immediate response was absolutely incredible. The police, the NHS, who deserve our thanks and praise for the incredible efforts, but also the individual, ordinary and extraordinary people who stepped in to prevent others being attacked, to confront the terrorists directly, at risk to their own safety. Taxi drivers who provided free transport out of the area to those worried, to local people who opened their doors to complete strangers to charge a phone or for refuge, and to the hotels, business others who offered shelter overnight. And in the ensuing days, the public response was incredible. Donations of almost £50,000, direct support from other businesses to a similar level, practical support from Barclays on Borough High Street, who provided office space to those who could no longer access their own premises, and even British Transport Police opening up their counselling service to those traumatised by what they'd seen. And of course, after in the weeks after the reopening, the solidarity from the local community was, again, incredible. From businesses, News UK and Emerging Market providing vouchers to staff worth tens of thousands to use at Borough Market. Southwark Council providing rates relief of over £100,000, and Sadiq Khan freeing up £300,000 from City Hall, to help the local community. Funding administered by United St Saviour's, a brilliant local charity with a long history of helping the local community. And that response was much needed, because the attackers could not have known what a huge outpouring of solidarity they would trigger. But that help was much needed, because the attack may have just been 8 minutes, thanks to the extraordinary efforts and heroism of the police. But the cordon investigation closed the area for 10 days, affecting 150 local businesses. Now, many people will be familiar with Borough Market, but this isn't a place that just provides bits and bobs or personal groceries. It's a market that's been there for 1,000 years, and tons of produce is at the market daily. The market supplies restaurants, hotels across the capital and far beyond, and tons of produce was lost during the closure after the attack. Contracts to supply other restaurants were lost. Bookings at restaurants were lost. The London Bridge experience was directly affected and lost bookings. The total bill for those 150 businesses is estimated to be over £2 million. A couple of examples. Cannon & Cannon are a wholesaler of British charcuterie. Their losses were about £11,000, and they were able to access compensation. Turnips is a fruit and veg distributor, and they lost nearly £100,000 as a direct result of the attack and closure. Their insurer is Aviva. Now, Aviva have not paid out despite repeated requests to reconsider, and Aviva stand out in this in what happened last year, sadly, because they were the only insurer to not respond with flexibility. They were the only insurer to so badly let down the local community. And I hope Aviva's shareholders are aware of its terrible response and its insult to British values in these exceptional circumstances after the attack. And I should add that many insurers, AXA, RSA, Zurich and others who did work for Flex Provide Help, I'm grateful for their advice and support. And I thank very much the British Insurance Brokers Association and Association of British Insurers. I'm so grateful for their help over the last 12 months. I did not know about this particular area before, and they all accept that this clause is needed, and they've worked together to get the government to this point. Many of those organisations had raised concerns, however, before. I believe it's about 2.5 years ago that the Treasury was warned, and sadly that warning was not heeded. The insurance challenge was recognised. It's clear from the briefings for this debate, it's clear in the Home Office bill briefing. The government-backed pool reinsurance system was set up in the 90s and only covers physical damage, not business interruption from investigations into terror attacks. I welcome the new clause to close that loophole in future, but the government is currently only planning for future incidents, despite the fact that the explanatory notes for this bill make specific reference to Borough Market and the difference it could have made to those affected in my constituency last year. I find the Home Office stating that this clause will not be used to help those so badly affected last June. I find that a very, very bitter pill to swallow and very difficult to understand. I hope the government will reconsider this matter and allow a retrospective start date for all of 2017. And I do that for four key reasons. Firstly, my constituency needs it. London Bridge and Borough Market need it. If it hadn't been for public donations, firms were at risk, jobs were at risk, Treasury revenue was at risk, and one micro business had even had their mortgage covered on their home as a result of public donations. That situation did not need to happen. And sadly, despite all of the public response I have mentioned, the government was not there last year. I find it absolutely shocking. We had the Prime Minister visit and show the Prime Minister of Australia around. We had a business minister come and meet with those employers directly affected. We had the Economic Secretary to Treasury's predecessor meeting here for some of those businesses affected, but not a penny of central government support came to help my local community, and this clause is a chance to rectify that absence from 2017. And thirdly, the fact that the government was warned of the need to close the loophole and failed to do so, I think, is justification enough for retrofitting this clause now, because my local firms and employers were unacceptably exposed to that loophole. And finally, the fourth reason is pool reinsurance. The government team has the funds. There is no cost to the Treasury. There's no cost to insurers or taxpayers for retrofitting for last year. It is simply willful negligence, in my opinion, to deny help to an area so badly hit when the finances are there to allow support. So I close with that plea to the government to extend coverage to last year. I welcome this clause, but I want it retrofitted. And I hope that ministers will be sympathetic to that aim as the bill goes through committee stages, in which I hope to participate.
John Howell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I start by, since this is the first time that I've seen you since the weekend, in congratulating you on your damehood. I'm sure it is much deserved. The purpose of this bill is to follow up on the 2017 Queen's speech to review our counter-terrorism approach. And its specific purpose is to amend certain terrorism offences to update them for the digital age and to reflect contemporary patterns of radicalisation and to close gaps in that. And I want to comment first on the potential for the prison system to add to that radicalisation. As a member of the Justice Select Committee, I don't think that there is a single prison visit that we have ever made where we have not raised the question of the radicalisation of prisoners. It is everywhere within the prison system, and the prison officers we've spoken to try their very best to be able to deal with it. And that is with a great deal of difference in success of that. But it is an issue that I think the Right Honourable Lady was right to raise, and it is one that we ought to be taking very seriously and looking at in a very careful way in order to make sure that these points are taken into account. I was also very pleased to be... Of course.
Honourable friend, he will have heard and he knows that the bill contains provisions to lengthen the period that prisoners actually serve, as well as the length of sentence for certain terrorist offences under this bill. Is he concerned that that will mean that terrorists will serve more time in prison and have more time to radicalise other prisoners while they're there?
I thank my honourable friend for that. In fact, on my notes to this debate, I had written next to that, so they will be more radicalised by spending more time in prison. And I think that that is a risk that we run with extending the prison sentences by ensuring that they are more susceptible to the influences that are going to affect that radicalisation process. And what we need to do is to address that in total from the beginning. Now, I was also very pleased to be able to intervene on the Secretary of State to get him to confirm that a purpose of this bill is to reduce the risk to the UK's interests overseas from terrorism. And that fits in very much with the contest strategy that is referred to, at least in the explanatory notes to this bill. Because I think that that is an important point to make on this bill. And to that end, I would point to the enormous commercial interests that the UK has in many parts of the world, including the Middle East and including in Israel, which are under threat from terrorist activity in the area, and particularly for those in Israel, which are under threat of terrorist activity from the Lebanon. And as we have discussed on many occasions in this House, Hezbollah has long insisted that its military and non-military activities are indivisible. This weekend at the Al-Quds Day rally, we saw the waving of flags for the alleged non-military wing of Hezbollah. Hezbollah, actually in its entirety, meets the test for full prescription, which would make it then subject to this bill. And I wonder whether whether the Minister would make reference to this in his summing up, and as to whether an amendment to this bill might prescribe the whole of Hezbollah. It would certainly send a strong message that together with America, with Canada and the Netherlands, we abhor terrorism in any form. And it would recognise that terrorist attacks on British interests overseas have to take their share of the blame. This bill rightly points to the need to amend terrorist offences to update them for the digital age, as I have said, and the need to keep them updated too, because the reaction to terrorism is an international one, and if the Council of Europe Treaty, which is referred to in the explanatory notes, is to mean anything, there is a need for international cooperation and international action on this subject. Thus, if an individual were to commit a terrorist offence in a foreign country, they would be liable under UK law in the same way as if they had committed the offence in the UK. And the explanatory notes refer to the Council of Europe Convention on the Prevention of Terrorism. And I do hope that this is the last debate on this subject that we will have, which doesn't mention the Council of Europe and its role in producing the Convention on the Prevention of Terrorism. We are part of the Council of Europe. We were founder members of the Council of Europe, and it plays an enormous part across Europe in being able to sort this issue out. It's a major subject of the Council of Europe. And indeed, during the course of debates at the Council of Europe, I have been very critical of the approach that has been taken, for example, by the Belgian government, who I think, in relation to the terrorist activity on its own soil, did not take the necessary steps before that took place in order to prevent it from happening. And I do think that there is a lot that we can learn from the international comparisons that we see there. And if I can give a couple of examples of that, one is in the way in which we could limit the finances of Daesh. And they are using the internet in order to gain finances and to move money about. And we have looked at that in the Council of Europe and looked at ways in which we can prevent the use of the movement of money by Daesh in order to take that forward. And another area of terrorism that we have looked at is cyber attacks, because that has an enormous impact on the UK position. And a cyber attack on an air traffic control system, for example, would cause absolute havoc. So there is a campaign within the Council of Europe that says no to the fear of terrorism, and I think that's something that we would all want to agree with. Now, The explanatory notes, as I said, refer to this, and we have looked at that in great detail. But the opening paragraphs of the Convention, which in many ways anticipate what is in this bill, the opening paragraphs of the Convention state that no terrorist act can be justified by political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic or religious considerations, i.e. there are no excuses for terrorism. And we also need to ensure that whatever purpose that there is within behind the act of terrorism, that we too respect the rule of law, democracy and human rights. Because otherwise we become just like the terrorists unless we respect those. And I know that that is a difficult thing for Western democracies to do, but unless we do that, we are no better than the terrorists, and I hope that we are considerably better than them. What we cannot be part of is the doing away of the values we hold dear in order to fight terrorism. Now, the Convention makes much of the need for international cooperation and also encourages the public to provide factual help. And I would recommend the excellent work that they take in order to influence the sort of line that we can take in the UK in putting forward a strategy that is convincing in dealing with terrorism and provides us with the necessary effects in order to make that happen. Thank you.
Gavin Robbins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Henley, and I've enjoyed, Madam Deputy Speaker, listening to a range of contributions this afternoon and this evening. A number of members, including the Right Honourable Member for the Deepings and the Honourable Member and Learned Member for Cheltenham, have made reference to the Investigatory Powers Bill that was considered by this Chamber just over a year ago, and any member that was present for that proceeding at that time. The second reading was the same day that Adrian Ismay, a constituent of mine, died, having been subject to an undercar booby-trap bomb 11 days earlier. It was a terrorist attack, it was a dissident Republican-inspired attack, and whilst this bill and the provisions that we are considering clearly come from Islamic-inspired terrorism and from a change of thought and emphasis, indeed, in this part of our United Kingdom, I do just want to make mention that we have not passed the worst days in Northern Ireland. There are still those who wish to use the worst vestiges of terrorism to change the political outlook, to change the determination of our people, to destroy our country. And I just think it's important, Madam Deputy Speaker, to make that reference at the start of this bill. I intend to mention just three areas, two specifically outlined within this bill, and one that I would like the Minister to engage with quite thoughtfully, which I don't think is considered at all within the published bill at second reading. Other members who have had the pleasure or the misfortune of participating in a bill committee may know more than me. I've never sat on a bill committee, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd be delighted to do so and delighted to get involved in some of these issues. Anyone that has sat on a bill committee tells me I'm mad, and that would be the worst thing to put yourself forward for, although there are provisions within this bill that I think it would be incredibly useful to have the opportunity to explore in greater depth. Border security. I think we need to be very careful about how we proceed with the plans within border security outlined within this bill. And although I am a Brexit supporting member of this House, I think it would be irresponsible of us to consider these provisions without having at least some cognizance of the issues that Brexit rise when it comes to border security. When the Right Honourable, or the Honourable Lady, the Shadow Home Secretary, raised her points earlier, the front bench from government were right to indicate that what this section does really emulates what's already provided for in the 2000 Terrorism Act
That is true. Legislative provision that has been here for the last 18 years, and indeed the only difference that I can see is that whilst the 2000 Act focuses clearly on terrorism, this provision within this 2018 bill goes to hostile acts and talks about state party actors. I assume that is the main difference. The most important part, though, of both provisions in the 2000 Act and in this 2018 bill is subsection 4. Subsection 4 in this Part 1 of Schedule 3, and in the 2000 Act it's of Article 41b, subsection 4. And the most important provision, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that it doesn't matter whether there's reasonable suspicion of engagement in terrorism or hostile activity or not. So whilst both parts of the Act in 2000 and the legislation outlined here today in 2018 go to extraordinary lengths to outline what is meant by terrorism, or what is meant by hostile acts, what is meant by terrorist activity, what is meant by state party activity, both parts of both pieces of legislation specifically indicate to border officials who are asked to operate this legislation that it doesn't matter whether you have reasonable grounds for suspicion or not. The truth is, Madam Deputy Speaker, in both the 2000 Act and this bill, you don't need to have any suspicion at all of terrorism or hostile acts. To my mind, that can't be right. When we consider the checks that are going to happen, this legislation, the 2000 Act, specifically talk about travel to and from Northern Ireland, to and from GB, in between this United Kingdom from Northern Ireland to GB, from the top of Great Britain to the bottom of Great Britain, and with no reasonable suspicion whatsoever. Under terrorist legislation from 2000 or this bill today, it is appropriate to be stopped and questioned and potentially searched by one of our border officials. I'm not going to push it much further, Madam Deputy Speaker, at this point, but I do say to the Minister that in the atmosphere created around border controls, whether it's on the island of Ireland or between Northern Ireland and GB, we need to consider this more thoughtfully. When Scottish brethren, of which the Minister is one, complained during the 2014 referendum that it is inappropriate for a UK citizen from Scotland travelling to a UK airport in England that they get stopped and questioned, the answer was, well, this House voted for it in 2000 because it was contained within the Terrorism Act. The Common Travel Area does not allow you to be stopped and checked for citizenship, stopped and asked about whether it is appropriate to travel or not. When that happens from Belfast to Birmingham, and it's an affront to UK citizens that you're stopped by a Border Force official travelling from Belfast to Birmingham, those stops, those checks, those questions, offensively, are conducted under anti-terrorist legislation. And this bill that the Minister is putting forward today gives us the opportunity to thoughtfully consider, is that really the intention? Is that really what we want within this country? I'm never going to tie the hands of government who want to protect us from terrorists. But is it appropriate that an average citizen from one part of the United Kingdom travelling to another part of the United Kingdom is stopped under anti-terrorism legislation? I don't think it is, and I do hope that is something, Minister, thoughtfully we can consider as we proceed. In Chapter 2, Article 7, or Section 7, that's outlined within the bill, touching on terrorist connections leading to an aggravating factor in the commissioning of an other offence, I think it's wonderful, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are being included within this provision. When I say we, I mean us in Northern Ireland. I'm not sure why we were left out in the 2008 counter-terrorism bill. I'm sure there was good reason for it, following political discussions in 2007, but it's not right. And if you are somebody who is perceived to be associated or known to be associated with a terrorist organisation, be that Islamic, be that some other fundamentalist group, be that those originating within Northern Ireland, whether connected to loyalism or republicanism, I think it is appropriate that that serves as an aggregating factor. But again, I raise this question, Madam Deputy Speaker. How does the Minister believe prosecutors will be able to convince the court that an individual has a terrorist connection? I know from my experience within the judiciary in Northern Ireland, I know from the experience of looking both as a barrister and as a politician, it is extraordinarily difficult when asking a court to accept that somebody has a terrorist connection, unless they are similarly, as part of that prosecution or previously, convicted of that offence. And I'll make this gentle point to the Minister, that this undermines community confidence in policing and security in this country. When they know a provision is there in the statute book that says that there should be an aggravating sentence, an aggravating factor, an association of terrorism, when they know, as the dogs in the street know, Madam Deputy Speaker, as it said in Belfast, that somebody is associated with or involved in paramilitarism. Yet there will be no motion in court that that individual should be sentenced with an aggravating offence. Why? Because there either be an unwillingness to prove it or an inability to prove it, Madam Deputy Speaker. The unwillingness will stem from the intelligence that our security services have, which they do not want to share in open court. Colin Duffy walks the streets of Lurgan in Northern Ireland because of an unwillingness from the judiciary in Northern Ireland to allow intelligence to remain private. Dissident Republicans that have terrorised and tortured our society to this day and are still intent on destroying Northern Ireland and taking us out of this United Kingdom walk the streets today because of the inability to present what was otherwise intelligence in open court. And the judiciary have said, well, if you can't do it, then don't bring it to us. If you're not prepared to openly show it, don't bring it to us. And so whilst I think it is wonderful that we are being included in this provision for the first time in 10 years, because we didn't feature in Northern Ireland as part of the 2008 Act, I'd like to know, I would be keen to engage with the Minister, I'd be keen to hear just how this will proceed through open court process, just how such prosecutions will be made. Madam Deputy Speaker, without going into the details, because sub judice, there are cases at the moment where individuals are being prosecuted in Northern Ireland because of how they signed off a text message with a Latin phrase, qui separabat, who shall separate us? It is the motto of a prescribed organisation in Northern Ireland. Is that as far, without divulging intelligence, prosecutors are going to go to try and satisfy membership or association with a prescribed organisation? If it is, then, whilst great to be included, I suspect any sentence given in a court in Northern Ireland will never benefit from an aggravating feature. Never benefit from an increase in sentence. So I do look forward to having the opportunity to meet with the Minister and discuss this further. The final part of my contribution, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to bring to your attention was Section 1 of the 2006 Terrorism Act, which dealt with encouraging support for terrorism or glorification of terrorism. When it was put forward in 2005 and it was enacted in 2006, there was some discussion about not only encouraging those to engage in terrorism, but glorification of past offences, and a 20-year limit was put upon such provision. Not in the legislation, spoken about openly, formed part of guidance to police services, that it's okay to glorify terrorist crimes, Madam Deputy Speaker, as long as it was more than 20 years ago. That can't be right. And I do hope that the Minister will take this legislation and potentially accept amendments, whether it's in committee stage or report stage, that will rectify that situation. It is appalling to me that people who were intent on removing life and destroying our society can legally eulogise such vile acts. And I don't need to make that point, Madam Deputy Speaker, from my perspective, from a Northern Ireland perspective. We're 7 years off 20 years from the 7/7 bombings. Can I ask anyone in this chamber whether they think it would be appropriate for any group in this country to memorialise or eulogise the perpetrators of that vile act? We're 7 years away from the potential for that happening if the 20-year guidance is accepted on historic acts from the 2006 Terrorism Act. That is something that I think we should thoughtfully consider. I'll give you an example of D Company, an IRA company in Belfast, who parade through the streets of Belfast each and every year. They are dressed in paramilitary-style clothing. They wear black berets, their black sunglasses, smocks over their faces, military jackets, flags, bands and replica arms. They are encouraging, to my mind, glorifying acts of terrorism. The NIO is responsible for a body called the Parades Commission. Do the Parades Commission even deem those parades sensitive? Never mind ban them for breaching counter-terrorism legislation. No, they don't. They take no interest in it. When we think about whether historic acts have the potential to glorify or not, take this quotation from their 2017 main speaker. British rule was wrong in 1916 and it remains wrong today in 2017. Let nobody tell you any different. The D Company of the IRA in West Belfast was one of the most notorious. They're attaching themselves to 1916. They were responsible for historic acts during the course of the Troubles. But they are making the connection very clear under the terms, in my view, of the 2006 legislation. Very clear indeed. The same principles that applied then apply today in 2017. If that's not a glorification, Madam Deputy Speaker, of previous activities or an encouragement to others to recognise that the conditions under which they proudly volunteered, in their view, don't equally apply today and isn't an encouragement under this legislation, then I don't know what is. But when those responsible for the Shankill bombing unveil a memorial 20 years to the day after carrying out that heinous act in 1993, then I think we've got a problem with legislation that tries to account for what is a historic act that can't be seen as glorification or an encouragement. And I raise it, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the hope and in drawing the analogy, because not only have we had horrendous attacks in the last year here in England, we're not going to have to wait too long until we're 20 years after the 7/7 attacks. And if members in this chamber are as horrified as I am at the prospect that such acts should be or could be lawfully, sensibly in our society eulogised, then this bill gives us the opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to do something about it. I do want to thank the Minister, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Security Minister, because he has engaged with us over the last number of weeks. We've had the opportunity for briefings, and I do hope that in this second reading and proceeding to committee stage, we'll get the opportunity to shape this bill so it does provide what we need to counter terrorism in all its forms in this country.
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a pleasure to follow the member for Belfast East, and perhaps particularly so because I think at least an element of my speech would have exhibited a degree of naivety, so I will continue with it. But at least I think I should apologise for it in advance. The purpose of the first part of my speech was to kind of juxtapose my experience of terrorism in this country based on what was happening with regard to the IRA and their activities in this country. And part of the premise of that was that we had travelled through a period, and post-Good Friday Agreement, we were in a position where any occurrences that now happen in Northern Ireland make the news in a considerably lower level format than they would have during my time growing up. So it is almost easy to believe, viewing Northern Ireland from a distance, that all is well over there, peace has broken out and the world is a good place, whereas actually the incident that was mentioned at the start of that speech clearly proves that that's not the case. Now, the reason that I was drawn towards making this comparison is that it's my 50th birthday this year, and the troubles starting in 1968 and my experience of how that impacted us in this country over that time. I mean, I don't think I'm old enough to remember this, but I think 1972 might have been the first cynical ceasefire that the IRA announced over the Christmas period, and yet only a short time later we had the bombings in Birmingham. Now, I fully appreciate that nobody has been convicted of those bombings in Birmingham, so it's not possible for us to say with a degree of certainty or attribute the cause to them, but I would say we are fairly comfortable in knowing the IRA was responsible and many people lost their lives at that time.
Of course.
Giving way. Does he share the concern of those in this side of the chamber within our party and perhaps further afield as well, who see the glorification of play parks in Newry, named after an IRA volunteer who was involved in a campaign of murder and terrorism? GAA clubs who name their venues and locations after IRA men and IRA women who have been involved in terrorist activity. Does he share that concern that we have of glorification of their activities in a way that this bill, if it has the power, hopefully it will have the power to change and to make it unlawful, and therefore it can't happen?
I absolutely do share those concerns, and I sincerely hope that the bill does present the opportunity for preventing that happening. I think the comparison that was made by the member for Belfast East is, if we were to experience something similar in this country, we would all think it was, an abomination, and yet clearly that's what's happening over in Northern Ireland. And so, moving through this period, clearly if we come up to one of the comparisons that I was going to make, 1996, the IRA exploded what was, I understand, the biggest bomb that has been exploded on the mainland since the Second World War in Manchester, £1,500 bomb. Fortunately, though, notice was given, 90 minutes of notice was given, and the excellent work of the emergency services allowed 75,000 people to be evacuated, although, unfortunately, services were unable to defuse the bomb, and I understand 200 people were still injured. But the cost of that bomb, running in the equivalent of today, approximately £1.2 billion, I believe. But in terms of how this country responds to that sort of situation, I think that is to be celebrated. 1996, England was hosting the European football tournament, and the following day, Germany were due to play Russia. That game proceeded and turned into a celebration of the fact that countries around the world would not be oppressed by terrorism, and actually joined together in a celebration that said terrorism will not win. Now you compare and contrast that to the bombing in Manchester last year. An Ariana Grande concert targeted, knowing full well that parents would be there with very young children. Completely despicable. Now my understanding is that the perpetrator, who was also killed in that attack, had been to Libya and had some Libya connections. And I think, to draw back to that parallel, clearly Libya has been a source of great difficulty, given the fact that association, and obviously the association that they had with the IRA previously, with that suggestion of the supply of arms and a fight against what was considered to be British imperialism. So what we need to say is, clearly we're not going to take terrorism, we're not going to accept terrorism, and we're going to do everything we can to ensure that our laws are tidied up to prevent it. Now, an element of that, and something I'd like to celebrate, is the idea of biometric data. Now, clearly, we should celebrate the fact that DNA was discovered in this country many years ago. Obviously, the double helix formation was then subsequently identified, but it wasn't until 1984 that Sir Alec Jeffreys was able to realise the benefits of using DNA to profile people and help determine the difference between pieces of evidence. We should celebrate this, I think, because DNA profiling is now used by 120 countries around the world, and 54 of them having DNA databases. And it's not just the fact that this technology is used to help identify people who are guilty, it also helps those who are innocent. In fact, its first use was in a case just 2 years after its discovery, a local case in Leicester where somebody had admitted raping and murdering somebody only to have the DNA evidence prove that they were not actually responsible. And then sometimes subsequently, Colin Pitchfork was identified as the actual murderer as a result of DNA evidence. So it is important that we realise the benefits of modern technology, the pace with which it can change, and we need to ensure that in this House we make sure the law keeps track with those developments. Because now we have the opportunity for people to be radicalised at their home in the UK by reading literature produced in other countries. We need to ensure that we act appropriately to prevent the dissemination of that sort of information. And if we go back to the bomber in Manchester last year, that person acting alone, thanks to the benefit of the internet and these illicit sources, has the opportunity to identify how to make a bomb using freely available items in this country. So with no contact with other people in a physical sense, they are able to garner the information, be radicalised and carry out a dreadful act. It is surely essential that we do everything we can to tidy up the law in this country to prevent that. And I would just like to end with a quote I heard yesterday. Law is reason free from passion. Aristotle apparently said that. Well, I think it's important that in this House we're not totally free from passion, that we remember these dreadful atrocities that have been committed and we ensure that we have law that prevents them.
John Woodcock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Walsall North. And I've sat here and listened to some very thoughtful speeches. In particular, the Honourable Member for Belfast East gave us a lot to think about on an issue which I had been hoping that the Home Secretary would have covered in his opening remarks. This new provision to make encouragement, effectively, of terrorism through statements that fall short of specifically inciting support for prescribed terrorist organisations. And this is a really important provision, as the Honourable Member for Belfast East has set out cogently in Northern Ireland. And look, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a really difficult subject to raise, but I am brought back to some of the remarks that have been made by members of my own of the Labour benches in the past, some when they were MPs. The fact that we have the man who would be Chancellor of the United Kingdom, apparently in 1986, having praised the ballot, the bomb and the bullet, is deeply, deeply serious. And if my understanding of the new legislation which is being brought forward is right, had that legislation been in place at the time, which the Honourable Member apparently made those remarks, he would have been guilty of a terrorist offence. If the Minister is able to share his understanding on that, or he's going to let me do so, raise it alone. And it does, I mean, it is a serious matter in of itself, but how wide-ranging these new powers could potentially be deserves, I think, great thought by members in the committee stage. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the case of Ethan Stables, a young man in Barrow, aged 20, who's just been committed under existing terrorism legislation. Ethan Stables, on the 23rd of June last year, posted on Facebook that he was going to war, that he was preparing for a slaughter in relation to, and he was planning to attack an LGBT pride event which was taking place at the New Empire pub. Now, fortunately, this man these posts were immediately seen by someone local. The alarm was raised and he was picked up by the police as he was walking on his way to the New Empire pub. He was convicted of terrorism offences. It was found that he had a machete and knives in his home, that he was a neo-Nazi sympathiser, that he had Googled things like, "I want to go on a killing spree." What is prison like? What is prison like for a murderer? I mean, the signs were clearly all there, Madam Deputy Speaker. And there is a separate question about why it took so long to pick up Mr. Stables, and he was literally on the verge of attacking people who were celebrating the community event in the New Empire pub. But surely, if the legislation had been in place, and in future, the fact that Mr. Stables had repeatedly viewed violent videos online, had looked about how to download and create his own bombs, that would have made him guilty of an offence long before he got to the stage of actively planning. So that in itself is surely a reason to welcome this new legislation. But the case of Mr. Stables does raise a wider question through all of this of resources, because it is all very well having the offences in place, and the government is going to need to explain more about how it feels it's actually going to be able to get prosecutions earlier on in the process, rather than finding a reason once someone has been apprehended for other reasons to go back through their viewing history. And for example, it's my understanding that there is no requirement, nor indeed legal possibility at the moment, of these internet companies like YouTube, of routinely providing the IP addresses of people who have viewed more than 3 times the material which is banned and would make them subject to criminal action under this terrorist legislation. Videos which, if YouTube kept up after having been warned about them, they themselves would be guilty potentially of a criminal or certainly civil offence. I'd like the Minister in his summing up to address that, and whether it is something that he would look at potentially bringing forward, so that there is a potential to catch more people who are online at the time that they are doing it, rather than as part of some retrofitting. The Home Affairs Select Committee took evidence last week from the Met Commissioner, Cressida Dick, and she was quite clear about the scale of pressure that her resources are under, even at present, and went through a number of areas, including, of course, counter-terror, where more resource was needed, where the amount that we got, the amount available was inadequate at the time. And yet this creates a whole new tranche of offences, which, unless the Minister can explain otherwise, is not going to be sufficiently resourced to be properly policed. Now, the other major omission, as the Minister will no doubt expect me to raise, as we've been backwards and forwards on it in the House and outside of it for many months now, is over the issue of returning jihadis. Now, it's good to get the recognition from the Home Secretary in this debate that the Australian-style offence is something which potentially he is potentially considering to introduce at amendment stage. And because I can see no other way in which the government is going to be able to get close to getting sufficient evidence to prosecute people who are returning from the likes of Iraq and Syria, and I have to say wherever the next terror hotspot is going to be, because this will not be the last. The minister knows that I was able to interview at length someone who was being held in a removal centre in Izmir in Turkey, who was being detained on suspicion of support for Daesh, and was being removed back to the UK on those grounds. There was suspicion at the time, Madam Deputy Speaker, about what would happen to the woman who we interviewed. That the very tough rhetoric that we hear from the government, that we always seek to prosecute individuals, is not actually commensurate with successfully being able to prosecute individuals once they were here, because clearly there are only people are going over. If you're travelling over to Syria without a very specific and verifiable reason, like as was raised earlier, that you are part of aid work there. I mean, it is clear that you are not going for valid reason, and yet at the moment you need verifiable proof, which is apparently very hard to find to be able to prosecute people. Now, when a number of us repeatedly press the government on this, ministers are still, and the minister can enlighten us all in his closing remarks if he wishes, but for many months now, the government has refused to give the number of people who have returned from Syria who have been successfully prosecuted. The response now is that those numbers are not quantified in that fashion. Well, they were quantified back in May 2016 when the Advocate General, Lord Keane in the other place, gave a written response, and back then he said that 54 people had been successfully prosecuted with 30 ongoing cases. So clearly it's possible to update the House on this, and the government is choosing not to. And our strong suspicion is that they are choosing not to because so few are able to be prosecuted. Oh, yes, well, of course, absolutely.
I may help the honourable member. It's 40 have been prosecuted so far, approximately 40, either with direct action they've carried out in Syria or indeed subsequent to coming back, linked to that foreign fighting.
Well, I thank the Minister very much for updating that. I note that the 40 number is less than the 54, which apparently we had prosecuted according to Advocate General Lord Keane back in May 2016. So I need to interrogate the figures as to why those two are doing it. But I am grateful, after many months of pushing, that he's given a figure of 40. Now, as you will know, 400, the government, according to the government, have come back. So only 1/10 of people have able to be successfully prosecuted. that is a very significant thing. Now, the government, the ministers in response also are now saying that a significant proportion of the people coming back are no longer of concern to the security services. Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, that's as may be, and it's a good. We want that number who are no longer concerned to be as high as possible, but that it does not mean that they are innocent of terrorism charges. If they have been over to Iraq and Syria, if they have been aiding Daesh in whatever form they have been doing, and they're British citizens and they return, they have been aiding enemies of the British state, people who have wanted to enact violence on our civilians, on our armed forces, and they should be able to be prosecuted, which is why the Australian-style legislation, the declared areas fence, is surely a step forward in that, because it would say that anyone who has visited a designated terror hotspot without good reason, overseen by, with declarations overseen by a judge, can be prosecuted for terror offences on their returns. And that, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, would go a long way, I think, towards the deterrent effect, which understandably the government wants to create to stop people from taking the crazy journey into war zones to support jihadi organisations that seek to destroy our way of life.
Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to be called to speak in this debate, and particularly to follow the honourable member for Barrow and Furness, who's just made a very thought-provoking speech. Certainly it was interesting to hear his references to one or two on his own benches, on his own front bench, although I think it's probably better I focus on the substance of today's debate than whether I agree or not with some of those comments from him. But I would say it's important that now we do look at how we make sure those who actually actively set out to seek to support terrorists and support organisations that do not wish to engage in a debate in a democracy but wish to destroy democracy, and how they actually feel the force of the criminal law. I must say I was very pleased in reading this to see the moves to update the legislation to reflect the fact that we are now in the internet era. I have to say that it will have to be tempered with making sure there are, and perhaps in detailed consideration in committee, that it is tempered with ensuring that nobody could innocently fall foul of some of the offences that are in that. I was very reassured to hear some of the comments from the Home Secretary in response to a number of interventions on this point, and how it would almost be certain there would be some sort of reasonable excuse defence that can be raised in terms of those who might have stumbled on material, or who may have been engaged in actual research, or in methods that actually we would want to see them being able to do, that is not connected with an intention. I'm conscious those definitions would have to be drawn fairly tightly to make sure there wasn't a loophole created by someone just claiming they were engaging in research, but actively showing that they were part of a recognised research project. But I'm sure those are things that can be sensibly worked out in detail. The one thing I would say is when we talk about the intention, it's always very clear that we must make sure our intention is clear in the legislation we pass, rather than hoping the courts will listen to what we said or that. We must be clear that it's actually the wording of the legislation that ultimately courts will consider in deciding on any of the defence. But I was very pleased in what I heard, and it's right that we look to move to end a position where if you stream something, that doesn't potentially bring the law into effect, given the explosion of sources, not literally but figuratively, available where you can stream video and stream things to your mobile device in particular, compared to in the past where it would be downloading from sharing sites. But I think it's appropriate that we make sure we have in place the protections that ensure nobody's going to be innocently caught up in that. In terms of the move to increase sentences, I think it's appropriate that we have a more significant sentences available to the court for the offences that are listed in this bill. Certainly those who are looking to take part in plots to cause significant loss of life should know that the sentencing and powers available to the courts are there and will actually be used. I was particularly interested to see the Honourable Member for Cheltenham refer to what could be the sentencing when someone had pleaded guilty, and that therefore it is not just about everyone getting the maximum sentence. That is very unlikely to happen, but it does move up the bar for each person convicted or pleading guilty to these offences, and ensuring that they get a commensurate time in prison, and also actually a time in prison where it may actually be possible to do useful work with them to turn them away from an extremist path. Ultimately, this doesn't matter whether this is, and we've had debate on the Prevent, about what is the motivation behind this type of behaviour, be it extreme politics of the left or the right, be it those who base their extremism, their terrorism on a totally perverted interpretation of a particular religion. And we must be clear, it's always a perverted interpretation of a religion. No religion genuinely backs the actions of extremists walking into a concert and blowing themselves up amongst women and children who were just enjoying a concert for the evening. That actually having those provisions in place, that actually we can turn them away from that path. I certainly have found it interesting to listen to some of the debate, and I think the public are clear that there should be increasing sentencing provisions that will allow the courts to deal with those who are committing such offences. Certainly, having seen the stories over the last few years, and in particular looking back at the events of a year ago, when those who were hoping to use terror attacks to deflect the general election campaign, attacking innocent civilians during the middle of that, hoping that this would somehow terrorise people, to change policy, to get people elected to this place who might not agree with tackling. I think actually all they found was that they actually strengthened the resolve of those of us who were Democrats, as happened in the past when this Parliament was previously under attack, and its members, some of whom commemorated on the walls of this very chamber as we debate. We weren't deflected then from our confidence in democracy, and we won't be deflected in the 21st century from tackling those who wish to destroy democracy, but also making sure that those who believe that they can practice with impunity online views that they would never think of expressing in a public forum will know that the law will catch up with them there. In terms of the debate around retention of materials, particularly fingerprints, which was a matter the Shadow Home Secretary picked up around biometric details, there will clearly need to be some detailed scrutiny and debate. We would all say that there is a legitimate intelligence grounds for the police keeping such details following an arrest in circumstances where particular thresholds are met. We wouldn't say that immediately details should be destroyed merely because a particular offence wasn't proceeded with. I accept that that will need to be balanced with the fact that those who are wholly innocent shouldn't think that their data are always going to be on a database due to perhaps a mistaken identity that led to an arrest, or finding that there was perhaps a piece of intelligence that when checked out actually didn't compute. It meant that they were not guilty of an offence or unlikely to be. I think it would be interesting perhaps in committee to explore in more detail how this balance can be struck, because clearly it would not be sensible to be throwing away potentially valuable evidence that might at a later stage be able to allow the proceeding for an offence or prevent a commission of a further offence, but where someone being identified more simply, but again balancing that against the rights. I think the principle is right. I think the overall thrust of the bill is correct in this area, but again it's something that can be explored in some more detail when we come into the committee stage and in report stages in the House. So overall, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think this bill is timely. Certainly the threats against this country are growing, and not just from non-state actors such as Daesh, but rogue state actors who will seek to engage in behaviour that few of us would have thought would be likely even a few years ago. The use of chemical weapons on our own soil against two people is something that would have been unimaginable only a decade ago. It's therefore right that our legislation does need to be kept fully up to date. This bill will allow the House and Parliament as a whole to review the legislation, to look at it in more depth, and produce a bill that becomes an act that's firmly rooted in the digital era, not the era of the past. As touched on, in the past we'd have been talking about people displaying flags in public places as the main worry we had. Now it's about what they're displaying online, potentially under a false flag of a fake digital identity. But for me, This has been a useful debate. I do look forward to seeing the bill progress further, and certainly it's one that will have my support, and I must be encouraging to hear the views from across the House that indicates it's likely to be one that will receive cross-party support at this stage, subject to the further debate that we can have, which we can only have by giving this bill its second reading today.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I come to this debate wanting to be positive about attempts by the government to give our police and security forces the powers that they need in the fight against terrorism, and balancing that with the equal priority of making sure we don't hit our civil liberties and therefore give the terrorists a victory. And I'm sure already we've heard in this debate how different aspects of this bill are going to be judged with those tests. But, Madam Speaker, no one who has witnessed the horrors in London and Manchester last year can be in any doubt we do need to redouble our efforts to protect the public. The evidence is clear. The terrorist threat across the UK remains severe. And with that threat morphing into a diverse range of terrorist threats, including people acting alone, and with the numbers involved, if anything, increasing, the terrorist threat for our security forces and the police is probably at most difficult it's ever been. So Liberal Democrats will not at this early stage want to seek to oppose this bill. But ministers and those watching this debate should not take that as agreement in full or in part to these proposed laws. We need to scrutinise this bill to make sure we get that balance right. And it's already clear in this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, that there are serious questions as to whether at least some of these particular laws are necessary, whether they are properly based on sound evidence, and whether there are sufficient safeguards to prevent them being abused against totally innocent citizens. To my mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government may have a job persuading this House and the other place that these measures should pass totally unamended and in the form that we see them tonight. And in considering yet another piece of terrorism legislation, Madam Deputy Speaker, the House should recall the opinion of the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, Max Hill, when he was appointed just over a year ago. He said he thought the UK had sufficient offences in the fight against terrorism, and we didn't need any more. In a speech in October last year, he said, and I quote, "I would suggest that our legislators have provided for just about every descriptive action in relation to terrorism, so we should pause before rushing to add yet more offences to the already long list." Now, in his early comments on this bill, the independent review of terrorist legislation has gone on to say that the counter-terrorism bill does not contain a single new terrorist offence. Now, this assessment of Max Hill may seem at odds with what the ministers have sought to sway the House that they're doing tonight, and with what organisations like Liberty are complaining. Now, how he squares this circle is quite important, because he believes this bill is only clarifying what is meant by existing offences. Now, let's see in debate whether it is simply clarification or we are creating new offences. If one looks at Clause 3, Madam Deputy Speaker, which is about obtaining or viewing material over the internet, this brings in the 3-click rule, which you talked about in exchanges earlier on. And the question for the House is, do we think the line between committing a criminal offence, punishable by years in prison, is one extra click of a mouse? So you move from innocent at 2 clicks to guilty at 3. I think there has to be good reason why we look at that, because it is the intention behind the clicks as opposed to the clicks itself. And this House has to scrutinise that. On one level, it might seem reasonable to question the motives of someone who is looking at this material, continue looking at violence and hate inciting material. But what if the intention of that person was never pursuing actual terrorism? Maybe they were a journalist. Now, we heard that there are protections for journalists, but what if the person was so shocked and appalled at the material, they were drawn to looking at it again in their disapproval? So I do think we do need to make sure that innocent people, genuinely innocent people, are not caught. And I was actually quite pleased by the way the Home Secretary responded to that debate. It did appear that he was open to genuine scrutiny of that point, and that is very welcome. I think we need in that debate to make sure that we abide by the normal ways we approach free speech. We normally only criminalise free speech if there is an intention to promote harm, violence and hatred, or to carry out terrorist acts as a result of viewing material. And there is potentially a danger that this proposal crosses the line, so we need to look at it in detail. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my early reading of these proposals, I do have a few other concerns. The Honourable Member for Torbay talked about biometric data and how important it can be, and he's absolutely right. But the question is, and he touched on this, and I thought in a very thoughtful speech, about the issues of innocent people's biometric data being retained. People who've never committed a crime, people who've been unlawfully or wrongly arrested, should their DNA be kept, should their biometric data be kept by the police? Possibly for a short period, but what are going to be the rules here in terms of checking that their civil liberties and their rights are not constrained, and that biometric data is disposed of in a correct way and in a verifiable way when it's clear that they have nothing to do with any such crimes? And I'm actually not worried just about civil liberties in this point, and this may surprise the honourable gentleman. I'm worried about the impact on the government's negotiations for an EU-UK security partnership should Brexit actually happen. Ministers will know, whether from debates over the GDPR or recent ECJ rulings, that the UK may struggle to get an adequacy agreement from the Commission. The recent immigration data exemption from data rights like subject access requests are very likely, and rightly in my mind, to be sounding alarm bells at the Commission. Yet it is super vital in our fight against terrorism, in our fight against organised crime, vital for this country's security that the data flows between the UK and the EU, whether it's data related to the works of Europol, for Prüm, for ECRIS, for SIS-2. And I'm not sure if the government, with all the different things it's doing in this area, is presenting a very, very strong case for our EU colleagues. Keeping the DNA of innocent EU citizens, is that going to help our case for an adequacy agreement? And so I specifically want to say to the Minister, could he say in his summing up whether an assessment has been made of how this new bill will affect the UK's chances of securing this vital adequacy agreement so we can keep those data flows going to get these wicked people? And my concern about safeguards, Madam Deputy Speaker, is related to the way the Home Office often operate. In Westminster Hall this coming Wednesday, there's going to be a debate about Section 22, Paragraph 5 of the immigration rules, where they are used to refuse leave to remain in this country on the basis that the applicant is somehow a threat to national security. Now, this particular immigration rule has been used when applicants have made minor tax offences, Madam Speaker. Conduct which is not foreseen in the immigration rules, was not foreseen when Parliament gave the Home Office these powers. So when we debate new rules and new powers to officials, Madam Speaker, we have to make sure that the safeguards are there so they are not used for unintended purposes. Moving on to the contest or prevent strategy, I felt the Home Secretary seemed rather complacent that all was well with this strategy. And when one looks at the perception, the experience of some people with it, expanding refer rights to local authorities might seem a terribly modest measure, and I know the Security Minister thinks that, but the question is, how will it be perceived? I have to say, although the measure, I'm sure the Minister believes is harmless, if it's based on the assumption that there are many communities out there who think prevent is fine, that's an incorrect assumption. For many communities, rightly or wrongly, prevent is a flawed programme. Now, as I said in response to the member for Holland and Deepings, it may be perception. I absolutely accept that there are many successful individual projects and successful work within the Prevent programme. No one can deny that. But there's a long list of organisations inside this House and outside this House who have pointed to how Prevent has alienated at least some communities. And in our deliberations, before we extend referral rights, we should think about that. The Home Affairs Select Committee has warned about this. The Joint Committee on Human Rights, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights and Freedoms of Peaceful Assembly and Association, the NUT, Muslim Community Associations, the Independent Review of Terrorism legislation. All these people have worried about how the Prevent programme is seen. And given those widely held concerns, I'm actually surprised the government is choosing this moment to expand the programme. Surely it would be far better to restore confidence, restore trust, before involving people's local council. Now, many of us would support an independent review of the prevent strategy. I heard the Shadow Home Secretary making this point herself. I had hoped that the Government's Commission for Countering Extremism might lead on that. So I do hope the Government reflects on this matter further before it pursues it. There are clauses that one really welcomes in this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker. Clause 19, where the Government is attempting to improve the system of insurance against terrorist acts, I think is welcome. We've heard others comment on that. Can I ask the Minister to look at a specific point? That is, in relation to the problems that small businesses and larger businesses who are involved in hiring and leasing vans and cars are getting into. This is a real concern. I know they're lobbying Her Majesty's Treasury on it, because now of a change in law relatively recently, they face unlimited liability if the person who rented or leased that van then goes on to use that van to commit a terrorist act. And because of that unlimited liability, their insurers are saying, we're not going to insure you. Now, if a whole sector in renting and leasing vehicles is somehow hit because it can't get insurance, that is a huge problem for our whole economy and whole society. And while there may be some industry, private sector solutions, there is a vote, I'm told, to see whether there can be some mutual arrangement within the sector. If that doesn't work out, if that can't go forward, this bill may be a vehicle to tackle that problem, and so the terrorists can't undermine our economy in this sort of indirect way. The last measures I'd like to question the Minister actually are on clauses 1 and 2. As we've heard, Clause 1 extends the existing offence of inviting support for a prescribed organisation, and it does so such that the person commits this offence if they show support for a prescribed organisation and are reckless in this expression of support. And I intervened on the Honourable Gentleman Member for Cheltenham on this issue of recklessness. I think he may have misunderstood me. It's not his place now, so he can't come back on me. But clearly recklessness is in the law at the moment, and it's used particularly in relation to actions in the example he quoted. But even in physical actions of violence, and if whether people behave reckless in those ways, it's pretty controversial, because it's not seen as terribly objective. And there are different versions of recklessness in relation to physical violence. The Caldwell version of recklessness and the Cunningham version of recklessness, all found by courts of different interpretations of recklessness. Now, when that is applied to speech, that is much more difficult. So if it's subjective with respect to actions, the subjectivity in terms of speech and the impact of that speech on other people seems to me very, very difficult to measure. So I do think that this House is going to have to look at that in some detail. And Clause 2 talks about the clothing and how clothing might be linked to a prescribed organisation. My real concern is how general this is. The Minister will know that there are 88 prescribed organisations. Now, there are some of those that I think all around this House we'd be extremely worried if there were people going around with flags and encouraging people to join those organisations. But when was this list last looked at? And I'll give one example. It may be controversial amongst some members, but it's from Sri Lanka, and I think the last Labour government actually were wrong to prescribe this organisation, the LTTE, Tamil Tigers. Now, they have committed some horrific acts, some horrific atrocities. There's no doubt about that. But they, of course, were involved in what many people regarded as a civil war. And in this country, there are British Tamils who've become refugees. There are Sri Lankan asylum seekers seeking refugee status who clearly support the aims of the Tamil Tigers, even not their methods. And for them, it's a political movement. And, I have met young men and women who are Tamils living in the UK who wear a T-shirt. And on that T-shirt, there's one of the emblems of the Tamil Tigers. It's a roaring tiger head with 2 rifles. Now, Member Speaker, I've refused their kind offer of such a T-shirt, and I've not worn it myself. But I don't think their offer of the T-shirt should be punishable by a prison term. And I just want to know with the Minister, does he think that wearing such a T-shirt of a prescribed organisation is going to result in the arrest of these people? will the Minister say whether any individuals wearing any clothing with Tamil Tiger emblems on is going to put their liberty in danger if this legislation goes through? I'm afraid these are the sort of questions we're going to have to subject this legislation to as it is debated. Madam Speaker, I know the Minister is a reasonable, thoughtful man. He'll want to avoid unintended consequences and unintended injustices. And perhaps on all the points I and others have raised this evening, he will be able to satisfy our concerns. But in concluding, I'd simply like to quote from a letter to the Times last year, signed by leaders of the legal professions, as well as by organisations like Liberty and Justice. And they wrote, "Suggestions made before the general election that human rights prevented the police fighting terrorism are misguided. Human rights exist to protect us all. Weakening human rights laws will not make us safer. Terrorists cannot take away our freedoms, and we must not do it ourselves."
Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you for allowing me to catch your eye in this debate. And since it's the first speech that I made in this House since your colleague, member for Epping, has received her damehood, may I pay tribute to her in her absence from the chair. There is nothing more important or serious that this House could be discussing other than terrorist issues. Because what the terrorist does is seek to destroy the fundamental rights enshrined in democracy by undemocratic means. And we must do all in our power to prevent that. Before I get on to the bill itself, I would just like to address the comments made by the member for Belfast East. And I totally take to heart his comments about glorification of terrorist acts once they are so-called time expired. If I were a member of a family who had lost victims in those terrorist incidents, I would feel utterly sick. And I hope that he will succeed in his aim of being able to amend this bill somehow to be able to prohibit those activities. In saying that, and I take to heart what he said about excesses by our military, I think we do owe it to the military, and I don't suppose it will form part of this bill, but there should be also a time limit on the on the time that a serving member of our armed forces can be prosecuted for events that took place in a military campaign, including Northern Ireland. And I hope that somehow the government will find a way of being able to do that before too long. The debate takes place in the atmosphere described, as I've already alluded to in an intervention earlier, Madam Deputy Speaker, by Andrew Parker, the Director General of MI5, who said rarely in a public speech by such an official on the 17th of October 2017, describing the ongoing terrorist threat, and I quote, as a multi-dimensional, evolving rapidly and operating at a scale and a pace that we've not seen from these terrorist threats. Indeed, in the year ending the 31st of December 2017, there were 42 arrests for terrorism-related offences in Great Britain, an increase of 58% compared with the 261 arrests in the previous year. And indeed, my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, earlier in his speech said there have been 25 Islamic attacks since 2013, including 4 external plots since the Westminster atrocities. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to pay sincere tribute to the police, the security and intelligence services, who often put their lives at risk in very difficult and dangerous circumstances to keep us all safe. And they do a terrific job. As if that weren't enough, Madam Deputy Speaker, we then had the horrific attack on the Yulia and Sergei Skripal and indeed Sergeant Nick Bailey on the 12th of March 2018. And following those attacks, on the 14th of March, the Prime Minister further announced that as a part of its response to that incident, the government would, and I quote, urgently develop proposals for new legislative powers to harden our defences against all form of hostile state activity. House of Commons official report, column 856. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to go on to one or two of the actual provisions in the bill. And first amongst these is the provision to make a temporary exclusion to order and to disrupt and control the return of UK British citizens reasonably suspected of involved in terrorism abroad. Now, this is, as we've already heard from the exchanges just now, a very difficult offence to prove. And it is clear to me that this needs tightening up, and it's clear to me that where there is intelligence or other evidence that people who have deliberately travelled abroad to take part in terrorist training or atrocities deserve to be prosecuted when they come back here. And I was quite attracted to the idea of prescribed areas. Why would anybody want to go, for example, to Syria unless it was for a specifically valid reason, for example, as a journalist or as an overseas aid worker? Why would they want to go to Syria and put their life at risk? There is a defence in the bill for a reasonable excuse for having travelled to these areas, and I am very pleased to hear that my right honourable friend is considering that as part of an amendment to the bill. I'm also pleased that the bill contains the Road Traffic Regulation Act 1984 provisions relating to anti-terrorism traffic regulation orders, the so-called ATTROs. As we've so sadly witnessed from the Westminster attack and elsewhere, an ordinary car or van or lorry can be a weapon in the hands of a terrorist. And it does seem to me that the ability to be able to prevent people being in certain areas at certain times is a very sensible thing to do. In fact, any events where there are likely to be large numbers of people, it seems to me that we should be able to ban traffic from a wider area near those events. I was pleased to see in the bill that the terms of the bill are likely to extend certain terrorist offences for a term of sentence increased from 10 to 15 years, and that the sentence actually served will be longer than the norm prescribed after a sentence. But I do think, as I said on the intervention on to the member for Henley, we will have to watch radicalisation in our prisons. I know from hearings in the Public Accounts Committee that conditions in our prisons are getting ever more difficult, whether it be through the smuggling in of ever more dangerous drugs or understaffing or whatever. It is very difficult to police what goes on in our prisons. But I think that our prison warders and others have got to be ever more vigilant for radicalisation taking place in our prisons, and it's something that we must do our level best to try and prevent. I was also pleased that the bill contains provisions for allowing government-backed reinsurance, so-called pool re, to be taken out for business interruption. Sadly, some of those small market traders in Borough were put out of business because they were for so long they were unable to trade. Finally, in the last few minutes that I've got left to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to concentrate on the area which I made several interventions earlier in the debate, and that is on the terrorist use of the internet. As has been said, the modus operandi of the terrorist is getting ever more fleet of foot, using ever more innovative methods, and therefore we as legislators have to get ever fleet on our feet in order to be able to counter that. And I do think the use of the internet is one area where the terrorist is still making greater use of it, and we have not yet got the powers to deal with it. And I take to heart very strongly the fact that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, said that 1.9 million items of potential terrorist material have been removed from the internet, which is a 17% increase on last year. So clearly the use of the internet is getting greater. Now, it's already been possible to prosecute people for downloading offences on the internet, but what it hasn't been possible is to prosecute people for streaming and indeed viewing possible terrorist material on the internet. And I know much has been said in this debate about the 3 strikes and you're out viewing this so-called material. But there has to be a balance to be struck here. Personally, I would have twice, because whilst once might be a mistake, twice almost certainly is not a mistake, and 3 times establishes a pattern of behaviour which clearly indicates that somebody is looking at that material with some form of purpose or intent. Now, there is the reasonable purpose excuse in the bill. So, for example, a journalist or a researcher looking at that material would have a reasonable excuse as to why they were looking at it. But it does seem to me absolutely right that there is an offence for looking at it. And I think it's absolutely right, too, that as the DCMS committee has been looking at, that we look at how the internet providers remove this material as quickly as possible from the internet, and there may well be a need to legislate if this doesn't happen with increasing rapidity. And I can't see, as I said in an intervention earlier in this debate, why the likes of Google and Facebook, who have some of the best IT writers on the planet, can't write programs and can't use AI in order to recognise this sort of material and take it down immediately that it appears. Because after all, that is the best remedy, so that people don't have the opportunity to view it. It's all very well prosecuting when they do view it, but if they don't have the opportunity to view it, that must be the best method. And I was interested, and I didn't want to know the precise mechanism because there may be security implications in it, but I was interested to know what discussions my Right Honourable friend had over in the United States with the internet providers as to what they could do on a voluntary basis to make this whole matter much swifter and much more effective to withdraw this material. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, there are some important, very important provisions in this bill. I welcome them. I think we do need to keep ahead of the terrorists. These are some of the most vile crimes on the planet. We need to make sure that people who contravene the norms of our democratic society are prosecuted, are convicted for a long time, are locked up, and they know that that will happen, and hopefully it will be a deterrent. Thank you very much.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The first, I think, duty of any state is to protect its citizens. Now, historically, we'd be thinking about that in terms of protecting ourselves from other states, which is still relevant today, but increasingly it is now from a threat of terrorism, whether it be generated here or internationally. And is that going to diminish in the near future, Madam Speaker? No, I don't think from any evidence I've seen, there's no evidence of that at all. Can I also begin by also adding my thanks to the members of the security services and emergency services who reacted so professionally to last year's tragic events in Manchester and London. And also, I think, remember that in 24 hours a day we have members of our police force, security agencies and armed forces keeping us safe. It's something we take for granted, but it's something we should always not forget. Now, in terms of the reaction to the events last year, I mean, I think there would quite clearly been a reaction that we need more legislation to counter what happened. And I think David Anderson, the reviewer of terrorism legislation, got it right when he said that existing legislation is there, and therefore today's bill really is to try and tighten up existing legislation. And broadly, can I say, Madam Speaker, I welcome the provisions that are in this bill. And the situation is quite clear that radicalisation is taking place on the internet. Now, is radicalisation or dissemination of your propaganda anything new? No, it's not. In times past, it would be in pamphlets, books, meetings. If you go back, for example, to the 1790s, you've got the Sedition Acts, which targeted radicals who were arguing for revolution from France, for example. So over history, governments have brought in various acts to try and stop acts or promulgations of terrorism or what is perceived as radical thoughts which are against the interests of its citizens. The new thing is rather different, though, because in terms of online radicalisation, it is not something that you can put your hands on in terms of a book or a pamphlet or close down a meeting. It's an international, global phenomenon. It's also, I think, the access point to it is relatively low. The idea that you need sophisticated equipment to be able to produce a video and upload it is not the case. We can do it now on smartphones or even on simple watches that some people have on their wrists, to speak. Now that's even different from when we were talking about the 2000 Terrorism Act then. So it just shows the rate of how this is changing very quickly, and it's right, I think, for the government to react to that type of threat and changing the way in which this type of radicalisation and propaganda is being put out there. The other side to it, which is not covered in this bill, but I'd be interested to know what the government are looking at, is in terms of terrorism finance. I know they've taken some steps already, but clearly, if you look at the open source literature in terms of the use of the darknet for raising money for terrorism organisations and organised crime, it is clearly an area which is seen as beyond the scope or reach of law enforcement. Now, in terms of extending the reach, I do support in this bill the proposal to be able to have extraterritorial reach into terms of being able to bring actions against those who are radicalising individuals from overseas. And I think, quite rightly, it has been an issue in terms of those returning from Syria and Iraq and other places that have been using that so-called safe haven to put out propaganda and trying to aim deliberately at vulnerable people to ensure that they can be radicalised and incite acts of terrorism here. I think the change in this bill to actually being able to prosecute those individuals is right. Now, many people know that I'm not a bleeding art liberal when it comes to this subject, but I am a little bit concerned about some of the things in this bill, and it's from two things. One is, are they practically going to make a difference? Or are they also, I think, going to give the opponents, not just of this bill, but general legislation against counterterrorism, a club on which to beat the government? And I think in terms of the viewing of online material, I think the government has given it, because in terms of the three views situation, my right honourable friend from Pontefract said earlier on it would be illegal to view something 3 times, but it would not be illegal, for example, for Google or Amazon, Google or another internet provider to actually host this material. Now, the problem I have with it isn't necessarily that it's something that needs to look at. I think it does, but it comes down to proportionality and whether there's actually a capability that this is not going to overwhelm our security services and police. Clearly, if someone is viewing things on a regular basis and you can build up a picture of what somebody's doing, then yes, quite clearly, we need to be able to have legislation or things to take against those individuals. But the key point to it, which I do pay credit to the former Home Secretary, Right Honourable Member for Hastings, in terms of her efforts to try and get internet providers to take this material down in the first place. And I think, it has already been raised in this debate around artificial intelligence and other ways in which this may be able to be done at a quicker pace in future. Although I know on occasions there might be sometimes when we actually want it to stay up longer so we can actually find out who is actually producing it. But I just say to the government in terms of this this part of the legislation is, how is it actually going to practically make a difference? Now it is, the government will have my 100% support for it, but I think what it will be is a diversion for campaigners against this entire bill, which would, I think, be unfortunate. And the Honourable Member for Kingston, who's not in his place, but raised the issue around the intent. And I think it is about intent. If someone's clearly downloading on a regular basis or actually share information, and that is already illegal, and I think it's quite rightly to be prosecuted. But I just wonder to what practical effect this will have, and whether we've actually got the resources to be able to police or enact this in the first place. Can I just touch on a couple of other areas in the bill? And one's about the management of those convicted of terrorism offences. Now, I know that many of my constituents possibly would think that if you've been convicted of a terrorism offence, you should stay in jail for life and never be released. Well, we know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is just not practical. And I think the bill does highlight an important point, is how we actually manage these individuals once they have served their sentence. Now, the Home Secretary, in response to my intervention earlier on, suggested that I suggested would it be done the same way, for example, of sex offenders who are released are going to be monitored in the community, and he said yes. Now, if that's the case, I think that's a good model, but that's expensive, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I just want to be assured that if we are going to actually have that type of monitoring, which is effective, I know in my own area, a good cross-working between the probation service and the local police, that the necessary resources are there at a local level, because quite rightly these individuals will need monitoring in some cases, and if we're going to protect our citizens, I think it's only right. So therefore I do welcome that provision, but with the proper resources at local level to be able to do it. Now, in terms of the provisions in the bill, in terms of the reference to channel panels from local authorities, I've got to say I support this. I think at the moment the police can make referrals, but it's quite clear that a lot of individuals come into contact not just with the police but other agencies, and there should be a mechanism for being able to refer them into prevent programmes. Now, the only caveat I would add on to that is that I think alongside this is there's clearly got to be some training or, again, resource put into those local authorities and others to ensure that they understand exactly how the system works. Now, we had a debate earlier on about the entire Prevent programme. Now, I know the Right Honourable Lady for Hackney and Stoke Newington raised the issue about Prevent and that it's not got the support in certain communities, and I recognise that. Part of that's down to, I think, a sustained campaign by certain organisations discredited. But the position I would always put to people, I'm not opposed to reviewing the situation, but you've got to put to the point is, what would you put in its place if you don't do it? And remember, there's a lot of talk about the Asian community, but people who are referred to Prevent are also in terms involved in right-wing potential acts of terrorism. And can I congratulate the government on actually its new emphasis on looking at right-wing terrorism, because it is not just a growing phenomenon in this country, but also across Europe. And if you look at some of the groups in Europe, they are certainly not benign, and the acts of violence against not only the local Muslim population, other minorities, but also in terms of the way they are using their acts of terrorism to terrorise individuals. And I think that is quite right. So, Prevent, yes, but if we don't have it, what do you put in its place? And clearly, I've not yet heard anyone say, give me an answer. So I have to agree with the member for South Holland, Right Honourable Member for South Holland Deeping, when he said that, yes, things can always be improved, and you always look for improvement, but again, I say, can I just touch in terms of this area as well, an area which I think does concern me a little bit as well. I'm not sure how we actually tackle this, Madam Speaker, and that's the whole issue around those individuals who are very vulnerable in communities. And there's at least one, I think, of the terrorist outrage last year, which had a mental health element to it. And how we identify individuals who are at risk, and they may not come into the orbit of a local authority, whether it's health service. We need a mechanism to look at that and how they can be helped, because clearly in terms of they're very vulnerable, and those minds can be preyed upon and used by people with the intentions and badness which they have. Now, how you would do that, I'm not quite sure in terms of, but I do think it's an area which we do need to to look at in terms of vulnerability. Finally, the issue around ports, and can I agree with the Honourable Member for Belfast East, who I think covered this very well in terms of, I think, some of the problems there. I see what the Minister's trying to do. I'm not really see what there's a need for it, to be honest, although it's slapped on the label that it's to obviously look at those state actors, and if it ain't to do with that, I've full support for it. But I do take on board the points which the member for Belfast North did raise. But related to this, and I think it's an issue which I think does raise issue around entry and exit to this country, and that's the issue around closed subjects of interest. And clearly Salam al-Abedi travelled in and out of this country, and from what I've seen didn't really get on any radar screen in terms of when he moved in and out of this country. So there is an issue, I think, around monitoring closed subjects and others who potentially could be of a threat, and where they're moving to and which countries they're moving to. Finally, Madam Speaker, can I just also add something to what's not in this bill? And I'll just welcome the Minister's comments and his winding up. And that's around the David Anderson report, who made some very good recommendations, some operational issues for security services and police. But there were issues around, for example, the selling of precursors for fertiliser, for explosives like fertiliser and peroxide, and also the issue around the hiring of vehicles. And I'm wondering whether the government are yet in a position to look at what he said on that, and whether or not they will be bringing forward proposals to tighten the regulation or monitoring of who is buying precursors for potential explosive devices, or the issues around the hiring of vehicles, which again have been very tragically used in some of the attacks which we've seen in 2017. So, Madam Speaker, can I broadly welcome the bill? It clearly needs a lot of scrutiny, and I hope that what comes out is proportionate, is at the end of the day effective, because I think that's what we all want. We want a piece of legislation which is effective and will actually prevent. I don't think we can ever get to a situation where we will prevent every single act of terrorism, but if we can make it as hard as possible, that's got to be our aim.
Shadow Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and this has been a wide-ranging and I have to say thoughtful debate. 2 years ago, our late friend and parliamentary colleague Joe Cox was murdered, and between March and September last year there were 5 terror attacks. And at the forefront of our minds are those who lost their lives in the incidents at Westminster Bridge, Manchester Arena, London Bridge and Borough Market and Finsbury Park, and those injured at Parsons Green. We think of Joe and those no longer with us. We think of the injured and their friends and families. We also think, Madam Deputy Speaker, of our magnificent emergency services who time and again showed extraordinary bravery and courage in the most difficult of circumstances. I also pay tribute to all workers in our NHS who saved lives, who treated the injured, and to all those services involved in the investigation and treatment of Sergi and Julia Skripal, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey, who's been rightly lauded on all sides of the House during this debate. I also pay tribute to the work of our security services when we think of what's not happened. Since the terrible murder of Fusilier Lee Rigby in May 2013, 25 terrorist attacks have been foiled and numerous lives saved. It is, of course, in the context of these events that the bill before us is to be judged. We all want effective legislation in this area. That legislation must always keep pace with technology and the times we live in, and we support the government in those aims. We also, of course, want to put public safety at the absolute centre of policy in this area and make it as effective as possible. Aspects of this bill do build upon the recommendations of the previous independent reviewer of the counter-terror legislation, David Anderson QC. And my honourable friend, the member for North Durham, was quite right to highlight the work that David Anderson has done in this area over a number of years. We are also concerned that the wider impact of terrorist incidents on surrounding communities and businesses is taken into account. Clause 19 of the bill is welcome in that it looks to widen the scope of the losses covered. It hasn't been the case that business interruption costs are covered where there is no physical damage to the commercial premises, even though we know that such business interruption occurs. And on this point, I pay tribute to the work that's being done by my honourable friend, the member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark, and say that we will be pressing the government at committee stage on whether it will cover such losses as have been suffered by businesses with regard to the incidents of the past 15 months, not simply those that will suffer losses in future incidents. So put very simply, will the government be compensating those businesses that have lost out in the past when they shouldn't have done as a consequence of this loophole? Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will be seeking to offer substantial amendments to the bill at committee stage. The Minister of State for Security and Economic Crime has indicated a willingness to be constructive. I absolutely take him at his word on that. And I hope he will consider all the amendments we intend to put forward in the constructive spirit in which they are intended. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, of course, we will continue to make the case for proper resourcing, a point that was made in the speech of the Honourable Member for Barrow and Furness. I've asked the Minister myself about that on a number of occasions, and of course we will continue to hold the government to account on its funding of our police and other emergency services, our security services, and indeed how much we pay the workers who do so much for our society. Turning to the bill itself, the first 3 clauses of the bill seek to update terrorism offences on expressions of support for a prescribed organisation, publication of images and obtaining or viewing material on the internet, the so-called digital fixes. Now, we of course agree that the law should be updated and keep pace with the times, but I do think these clauses will need work in committee. Max Hill QC, the independent reviewer of terror legislation, has said in recent days, and I quote, that the tweaks to existing offences range from pragmatic to problematic. And of course, with any change in the law, we have to ensure there is wide public consent. Again, to quote the independent reviewer of terror legislation, Madam Deputy Speaker, he said this last October: while we can all agree that there should be nowhere for real terrorists to hide, we should also agree that legislating in the name of terrorism when the targeted activity is not actually terrorism would be quite wrong. And that's why the legal frameworks we set in this House must be forensically considered, seeking to protect our daily lives and our values of freedom and respect. And it's absolutely vital that we guard in our criminal law against any unwelcome consequences. We will therefore be scrutinising the government carefully on what it means by reckless in the context of an expression of support for a prescribed organisation. On the issue of the photographs that are within the bill, we will clearly want to see the government will distinguish genuine threat from immature behaviour or other motives. And on the issue of the streaming of material as well as downloading, and of course I absolutely agree there needs to be an update to the law in that respect, but we do need to be clear about what streaming means. At present in the bill it's specified as 3 views, but I think a number of contributions in the debate from across the House have indicated that will need to be carefully considered. Of course, journalists, assiduous researchers accessing material for legitimate purposes, and indeed the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, should not be criminalised. So we will clearly be looking at the position of the government with regard to the reasonable excuse defence. With regard to the sentences, the additional sentences in the bill, the Sentencing Guidelines Council published its guidelines for terrorism offences on 28th of March this year, but that was of course based on the current maximum sentences. I will be grateful for reassurance from the Minister that the government will work with the Sentencing Guidelines Council on the new proposed maximum sentences. The releasing of terrorist offenders who are subject to extended sentences will be a decision for the Parole Board. And of course, there were concerns in a different criminal context with regard to the War Boys case, but I sincerely hope that the government will be able to give reassurances that shortcomings have now been satisfactorily resolved and there can be wide confidence in the parole board in carrying out such an important task. On data retention, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will of course look carefully at the government's justification as to why the collection of data from people who are arrested but not charged is necessary and proportionate, and what mechanisms there are in place for wholly innocent people who wish to have their data removed. A number of members have mentioned the extension of the PREVENT programme, and indeed Clause 18 of this bill gives local authorities the power to refer to channel panels as part of that strategy. Our policy is for there to be a review of PREVENT, and we will of course be considering carefully the capacity of local authorities in this regard in their current funding settlements. And indeed, at Home Office questions only last week, I did raise with the Minister my concerns about local authorities being given additional duties in respect of data without appropriate data security, appropriate training, and indeed the resources required. On the issue of border security, and of course we accept it's entirely reasonable for the government to be looking at this, Clause 20 of the bill activates Schedule 3, which is the power to stop, question and detain, which is a very broad power. I mean, Schedule 3.1.4 states, and I quote, that somebody can be stopped, questioned and detained whether or not there are grounds for suspecting that a person is or has been engaged in hostile activity. In his opening remarks, the Home Secretary was very clear that in circumstances such as these there should be robust safeguards, and I absolutely agree with him in putting that view forward. At the moment, the oversight in the bill is by the Investigatory Powers Commissioner, but I would suggest that working with the independent reviewer of counter-terrorism, who is, of course, at the moment the reviewer of Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, is going to be absolutely crucial, and that relationship will need to be spelt out as the bill proceeds.
On this point of detaining individuals, one obviously understands the need to do that in a whole series of circumstances, particularly at airports if individuals are causing potential risk. But would he also agree with me that it's absolutely crucial that in exercising those powers sensitively, one must have regard to potential compensation for those who have been stopped, subsequently found not to be guilty of any offence or any problem being involved, for example, if they miss a flight or have property taken off them?
I do agree very much with my honourable friend on that point, and how we draw the law precisely in this area is very, very important. Clearly, the powers that we see need to be backed up by appropriate safeguards and indeed protection for those who are wholly innocent of any offence at all. I would also raise, Madam Deputy Speaker, on this issue of border security, that the bill as it stands means that a detained person who is detained for less than an hour does not have the right to access a solicitor, and that beyond that, people can access lawyers, but they can be required to do so within the sight and hearing of an officer, which clearly has consequences for our cherished and valuable principle of legal professional privilege, where people can have A, the result to consult their lawyers, but B, to do so in private, which is something that we will want to again consider at committee stage, and I very much hope that the government will listen to points that are made upon that in terms of appropriate safeguards being put in place. Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that the considered nature of this debate will now continue into the committee stage. I look forward to working with colleagues on all sides of the House to scrutinise and hopefully improve this legislation in such a crucial policy area.
Minister Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's been a good debate today, and I think all sides of the House have demonstrated their desire to have a collaborative approach to counter-terrorism legislation. I am heartened by it and delighted that we can start the process in that spirit. And every point I've heard today has been made with passion and consideration and a genuine belief. While I may not agree with some of the points, I certainly recognise that this is not about posturing or anything other than trying to make an effective piece of legislation make us safer. So over time, while we're doing this bill, Madam Deputy Speaker, I intend to do as much as I can to work with all sides of the House to be as collaborative as possible, to work to see whether there are better ideas, to work to improve the legislation, to make sure that we can deliver it in a way that means that the intelligence services and the police and the local communities can feel that more safer than perhaps they are today. It was on 22nd of March, Madam Deputy Speaker, that many of us were in this House when we heard, obviously, the shots being fired outside all the horrendous events on Westminster Bridge. I myself was just about to come into the chamber when I heard a police officer say shots fired. And we lost that day our friend Keith Palmer, PC Keith Palmer, who did his very best to defend us from a man intent on killing indiscriminately and spreading terror. And on the 22nd of May, in this job as Security Minister, I remember just after about 11:30 being woken by a phone call by my office telling me of the dreadful news that in the Manchester Arena a bomb had detonated and killed a significant number of people. Manchester, my local city, Manchester, the arena where my own daughter had been only the week before. And it brought us back to the vulnerability that we face. And every single one of us in this House, while not directed to terrorism, will have fought that general election, where we felt probably for the first time, because maybe of social media, a level of hate and bile directed us all that made us feel a little uneasy about the society we're in and about what lies at the extremes behind that hate. Some of my friends from the other benches right now have been under threat from the extreme right. We remember our dear fallen colleague, but also I know in my part of the world I have a good friend who she has been under real threat from some particularly nasty people. And I think we have to reflect on that. But after the attacks, and often you get after those attacks, Madam Speaker, the pressure to have legislation. Something must be done. I'm proud that this government didn't rush to legislation. The first thing we did was we set up a number of reviews. The reviews at first were significant, but were consolidated into mainly 4 main reviews. The operational review, which produced a classified report of some 1,300 pages, that went into every single decision, piece of intelligence and work that went on in the lead-up to some of these attacks. I read all 1,300 pages, not just because I'm incredibly interested in it because it's my duty, but because only then can you learn what legislation will put right. Only then can you see what's reasonable to be asked by our security services and police and what maybe shouldn't really necessarily need to come to a statute book. We also had a counter-terrorism legislative review by the Home Office. We reviewed contests. We paused the sort of relaunch of contests and looked to see if there was anything that needed to be had. And a number of those reviews were oversighted either by David Anderson, the former reviewer of terrorism, or the current review of terrorism, Max Hill, viewed how police use the powers in the aftermath. And I think that gentle but solid consideration is why we're here today with a piece of legislation that I hope does help to answer some of the challenges we face. Because what happened in 2017 when the terrorists unleashed these attacks on us was it demonstrated very clearly not only the empowerment they now have through social media and through encrypted communication, but also how they have adapted to our statute book to find new vulnerabilities, how they have shifted their ambitions to find where we are not as protected as maybe we should be. And they have exploited that. I'm afraid good terrorists do that. Terrorists are all about our soft underbelly. They're all about our vulnerability. If they can't get an AK-47, they get a truck. If they can't get a truck, they get a knife. That is part of what they do. And if they can't do any of that, they intimidate and scare us with words and propaganda and exploit our people, our constituents, whether they are vulnerable or whether they are children. And Daesh is, let me say, Madam Deputy Speaker, some of the worst. They have no fuss about who they twist and corrupt. They don't care whether they're Muslim, they don't care whether they're young, they don't care whether they're abused or whether they're vulnerable or whether they suffer from mental illness. Anyone will do to carry out their twisted, murderous campaign. And despite the loss of territory in Syria, they keep their flame alive. They are now, as we speak, adapting. And as we speak, there are people in this country planning to repeat what we saw last year. There has been 5 attacks last year. There have been 4 extreme right-wing neo-Nazi attacks in this country over the last 12 months. And there were 25 disrupted plots since the murder of Lee Rigby. 3,000 current subjects of interest involved in nearly 500 live operations. A scale I've never seen before, and a threat that is a great challenge today because of that encrypted communication, but also because of the speed from which someone who doesn't mind getting caught can reach out, grab a knife, go out their front door and literally kill people as they see fit. So first of all, Madam Speaker, I could just answer some of the points raised today. The Shadow Home Secretary made some positive support for the bill in principle, and I welcome that. She, however, did highlight some of her concerns, and maybe I could answer them. In Clause 1 of the bill, the issue that is around encouragement, the worry about reckless encouragement, it's our challenge is to deal with people that go out to inspire people. It's no coincidence that Al-Qaeda's online publication with sections like just terror tactics placed in its pages is called Inspire. Because it's inspiration that has been partly one of the challenges that we face, where there are some very charismatic people in our community, some of them are currently in prison but due to be released, who have used their presence and their inspiration to recruit without actually muttering the words, "and I want you to join Daesh, and I want you to go and fight in Syria." And that's been part of the challenge. That's been what some of them, one individual particularly, responsible for hundreds of people being drawn into extremism, has used so well for so long. And that is why we have sought to try and plug that gap in that space of inspiration. In the area of prevent, I have to agree with a number of colleagues on both sides of the House that the substance of prevent, whenever I hear critics of prevent, and I say, OK, what would you do? They just describe prevent. And they come back to the bit about the brand. The brand is tainted. Fine. The brand's safeguarding. I'll sell you safeguarding all day long. We call it prevent. But it is about safeguarding people from being exploited. And the Shadow Home Secretary was worried about, did local authorities have the expertise? They don't have the expertise in counter-terrorism. But by golly, Madam Deputy Speaker, they have the expertise in safeguarding vulnerable people and children. And we should put prevent referrals in perspective. There are 9,000 prevent referrals a year, of which half of them are up to young adolescents. There are 621,000 referrals every year of safeguarding people from domestic abuse, sexual abuse, people being groomed. So let's put it in perspective. It's not a big brother spying operation. And the end result has been, in 2 years, over 500 people that we had serious concerns were on the path or about to be engaged in violent extremism and now deemed no longer to be a threat. That's 500 people. It takes one man to drive a van across Westminster Bridge. And in my book, that is a success. And yes, there are people who are worried about the branding of it. But I say 2 things to that. First of all, when I raise the extreme right or the neo-Nazis, people say, oh, well, prevent's quite a good thing for them. And the other bit I ask, when I say to them, when I look at people in the eye whose families have been prevented going to Syria, they don't argue with prevent. They say prevent works. And I believe that one of the reasons we publish the figures is actually the figures show. It puts it in perspective. It shows there are successes. It's not 100%. And it picks up, funnily enough, 30% of people who need other type of safeguarding. But often the people who attack prevent the most are the ones who don't want prevent to work because they are the flip side of the recruiters of extremism in this country. And that is, we should not forget that some people want the narrative to be, don't trust the state, we don't like the state, we don't want the state, Our way is the best way. And they peddle this myth. You'll hear the brand, things like, my uncle lives in a terrorist household. We've all heard that one be used, trotted out by the anti-prevent lobby. Actually, what the child said was, I live in a terrorist house and my uncle beats me. It never was a prevent referral, ever. It was a referral for abuse of the child. But the same people will peddle that till the cows come home. So I have to say that our ambition in Prevent here is really to broaden it, is to get the local community engaged, to get local authorities alongside the police and the referrals. One of the criticisms about Prevent, it was too police-focused. Getting local authorities alongside who maybe understand some of the nuances in the communities about whether that person is really being radicalised or not, and that if they say, well, we think they are, why shouldn't they be allowed to directly refer them to Channel? I think that is a good thing. It's not a step backwards. It is listening to some of those criticisms about it. The member for South Holland and the Deepings was absolutely right when he talked about keeping people safe. It's about safeguarding. And the question about more legislation. Do we have too much legislation or legislation enough? Well, there are two things. Britain is a world leader in counter-terrorism. So for all of our legislation, it's got us to a point where most countries around the world come to ask us how to do it. And most countries around the world are envious of what we have. But also, unlike other countries, we have probably the most oversighted intelligence services and security services and police and actions of our law enforcement in the world as well. A number of the measures in this bill are the recommendations of the independent reviewers. The hostile port stop power is because it was viewed by on two occasions by the independent reviewer that our police were abusing that power for CT to stop people we thought were posing as hostile state and recommended a separate power. The Biometrics Commissioner was the one who recommended the changes to the biometrics. So, on one side, the government has listened to some of these independent viewers and thought that is a good thing to do. The member for Paisley and Renfrewshire, can I welcome the SNP's support and principle for the bill, and of course I will continue to work with him and indeed the Scottish Government. I came into the Scottish Parliament with his Justice Minister. I had a phone call with him last night, and if he feels at any stage that they are not getting the engagement, then do not hesitate to get in touch and I will make sure that it is done. It is incredibly important that contest and our CT legislation reaches the whole fingertips of the United Kingdom. I noticed that when national action were prescribed, very quickly up popped something called Scottish Dawn, and indeed that is now prescribed as well. And it's important we don't muddy the waters where we all agree to agree. When it comes to reckless and the issue about recklessness, part of this is about how we make sure that people who are targeting people who they don't really care necessarily whether they understand or not. The issue about vulnerability. There's a man called Umar Haq who in March this year was convicted of radicalising or trying to radicalise hundreds of children at school. He got them to swear allegiance to ISIL. He got them to reenact the Westminster Bridge attack in their classroom, and he showed them footage of people being beheaded and said to those children, if you tell your parents, you will go to prison. Now, those people were vulnerable. In fact, they're children, and we have to find a way of making sure we make that, we close that gap about how much intent has to be involved and how much does the receiver of that information have to know what they are getting. My learned friend, the member for Cheltenham, absolutely gave an excellent example on reckless when he talked to baseball bat. And I don't think it's that different. I may disagree here with the Right Honourable Member for Kingston. It isn't that different in a sense that, you know, the law has established over a number of occasions where reckless comes in. My notes tell me that, to quote, R, VG and another in 2003. I think my learned friend is the only person who would understand what case that refers to. It wasn't a very enlightening note, but then, nevertheless, it shows that it has been done. His point about the hostile stop on the border, one of the ways we temper that no suspicion issue is by the fact that whatever oral statements are made in that cannot be used in court as evidence. And I think that's an important way of trying to balance it. But there is the issue about suspicion. If I was a agent of a foreign country, I would be trained. I would know the law for what I'm coming into, the country. So I'd give to my family member my electronic equipment. And if we had a no suspicion law, if we had to have reasonable suspicion, then you would have to have reasonable suspicion that everyone else travelling with that person. It would be harder to maybe adapt to something that you know or see as it happens. And I think that's one of the reasons. And you know, the current schedule, and I hear the Honourable Member, he's absolutely right about the impact it has had impact on my constituents in Preston, about the cost and what they maybe lose when they're stopped under CT powers. We do have to look at whether we can make sure the information is timely done so people don't miss flights. We have to absolutely do that. Sometimes it's too last minute, in my view, to make that important. But it has been incredibly useful. The Honourable Member for Barrow talked about foreign fighters and the challenges around that. 150 people have been stopped going to train and fight in terrorism because of that schedule. Because we managed at the airport to stop them, and in examining their electronic devices saw that they weren't really going on a family holiday to Turkey. They were in fact taking their 3 young children, for example, to Raqqa. No holiday anyone wants to go to, and those 3 children had no say, for example, in that at all. The member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark, I think you are going to be meeting the Economic Secretary to discuss this further. I absolutely hear what he says. I also want to pay tribute to his colleague, the member for Manchester Central. So she had talked a lot about loss around the arena of business, and I think it's right. And I'm glad he's called out Aviva. I think it's really important we remember, and it's the same for our constituents going on summer holiday. Slowly but surely over the last 10 years, travel insurance firms have dropped out terrorism from coverage. But the odds of being a victim of terrorism are still absolutely tiny. And so I've asked to see what we can do with the wider insurance companies to make sure that something that is at still a tiny, tiny risk of being a victim of should not be just casually dropped out of people's schedules. The MP for Henley, my honourable friend, he references Hezbollah. We, of course, keep always under review prescription. I hear what he says about it, and I understand the hurt people feel here when they see people flying flags of Hezbollah on the streets and things like the Al-Quds Day. And he talked about the Council of Europe. It is absolutely the case, and the broader point, that we need to engage those partnerships post-Brexit. We need to make sure that we continue with many of the tools, or all the tools that we use at the moment. The United Kingdom government's position is unconditional on that. That's what we would like to engage with. The question is for the European Commission, whether they would like to have that. Security is not a competition. Trade might be, but security isn't. And I think that is something that they understand in Europe, in my private conversations, and I hope the time we get to Brexit, we will absolutely see that in place, because it is the partnership both domestically and internationally that is why we are so successful in counter-terrorism. To the Member of Parliament for Belfast East, I can give you some good news already from the dispatch box. There is no 20-year bar on glorification of terrorism, nor will there be to do that. So in that sense, hopefully, he will be able to progress forward. To the member of Barrow-in-Furness, the Honourable Member, he's right. We have to find ways to explore the foreign fighter challenge. It's not just us, it's the French, the Germans, where we might have intelligence that someone is out there engaging, Mr. Speaker, but it's very hard to get the evidence. And we are going to explore during the passage of this bill new measures or other measures, which I am happy to work together, that hopefully will do that for us. It's also why we've extended extraterritorial jurisdiction, because it is ridiculous that you can sit in Syria and try and recruit people from the United Kingdom and somehow not be prosecuted correctly.
Am I right in thinking that the Minister of State is approaching a peroration as eloquent as Demosthenes, but markedly briefer? Minister of State.
The usual channels, Mr. Speaker, have taken on. I've lost the first battle. Mr. Speaker, in summing up, Mr. Speaker, and I apologise to the other members who contributed so eloquently to the debate. I would, of course, be happy to meet them outside the usual channels, Mr. Speaker, but others to say very clearly that we owe great duty to our intelligence service, the police, to thank them for all the hard work they do. And we will progress with this legislation. I will work in as much partnership as possible with all sides of this House to get a deal and a bill that works to keep us safe.
The Chair was merely making an inquiry, and there was a question mark at the end of it. But I get the impression that the peroration was not altogether unwelcome to the House, and we're very grateful to the Minister of State. The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The programme motion to be moved formally. Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The money resolution to be moved formally. Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The Ways and Means resolution to be moved formally. Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. We now come to the motion relating to the Women and Equalities Committee. Mr. Bill Wiggin on behalf of the Committee of Selection. To move. Thank you. The question is as on the order paper. As many as have that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. We come now to the adjournment. The whip to move. Thank you. The question is that this House do now adjourn. And, well, if members are leaving, I'm sure they'll do so quickly and quietly. And I can't believe there'll be hushed private conversations conducted by members who don't wish to hear the honourable gentleman dilate on the important matter of Cornish national identity in the 2020